Om Shri Sai Ram, offering my humble pranams at Bhagwan's lotus feet, respected elders and all my dear brothers, a loving Sai Ram and good afternoon to you all. We welcome you back to the post-lunch session of this national workshop on macro-stabilization policies for India during the post-pandemic period. I am delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nadhanael GV. Sir is the Director of the Division of Reports and Knowledge Dissemination as the Department of Economic and Policy Research in the RBI Central Office, Mumbai. He is also an editor of the RBI's monthly bulletin. Dr. Nadhanael received his PhD in economics from the University of British Columbia under the RBI's Golden Jubilee Scheme for Higher Studies Abroad. He was awarded the David Dodge Award for his academic excellence during the PhD program. Apart from his career in RBI, Sir also served as an external expert at the Bank for International Settlements and also collaborated with IMF and developed comprehensive macroeconomic models for India. He has published numerous research papers in national and international journals on topics such as inflation, monetary policy, financial inclusion, and so on. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nadhanael to the stage for his presentation on the topic of current state of global and domestic economy, challenges and opportunities.
Distinguished members of the faculty, honorable guests who were here in the first half of the meeting, and brothers, and I like the way it is called, Universal Brotherhood. And it is an honor to be here talking to you and on a very important topic. And today we had really good interactions, 2 wonderful lectures, and I'm privileged to follow 2 illustrious people. And today I thank the organizers for having me here. Without much further ado, let's get to our topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then we will take for questions. And as you would remember, the first half of the day we spent on 2 sessions. One was on fiscal policy post-crisis, and the other one was on also looking at how the fiscal policy was used for managing the crisis and the period post-crisis. Now, the next session would be following on monetary policy. So I was thinking, what should I be doing? Because if fiscal and monetary policy is covered. So I thought, since I'm actively involved in putting together the state of the economy and also involved in quite a bit of work at the RBI, I thought I would start with, or I would talk to you about the current state of the global and domestic economy, challenges and opportunities in the context of what has happened, not just in terms of pandemic, but the multi-shocks that we say, that there was the triangle shocks, the pandemic, the war, and now we have the monetary tightening happening across the world. Okay, so that's what I would be talking about. Now let me just go forward, and the outline of my talk will be, first I'll talk about current global environment, then we'll talk about recent developments in the Indian economy and medium-term challenges. And the overall approach that I would be taking would be to ask questions of why and so what, rather than thinking about what is. Because as researchers, economists, you should be asking the questions of why and so what, rather than asking the questions of what it is. Okay, monetary policy transmission has improved. Why? Or fiscal policy has become more pro-cyclical. So what? Because those are the questions that are more important than just understanding whether monetary policy transmission has improved or fiscal policy has become more pro-cyclical. So I would try to kind of keep your mind engaged, and I know that it's a post-lunch session, so I need to keep you engaged. So you won't see, you don't have to worry about what is written in the slides, because this perhaps would be the last slide that you will be seeing any text. So you would have to listen to me, and I would be looking at you, and that's the way to kind of manage it. So let's go about what happens to the global economy. So we are coming out of once in a century event, which we never thought would happen, but it happened, and now that we have to live with it. The global economy is actually coming out of a crisis, but it's kind of hit a rocky road. And you can see that the global growth is what is there in that chart, and you see that the emerging economies were growing faster, the green line, than the advanced economies, the blue line. But then everybody fell together, right? And then everybody went up back, and right now we are in that pick up, and then we've again slowed down because of multiple reasons, which we would come to later. But the important thing to note about is that if you take the decades of 2010s, where the global growth averaged at about 3.5 to 3.7%, we are going to be, in the next decade, as per the current projections, we are going to be like at least half a percentage point lower than what we were in the previous decade. So that means that the crisis, long-term effects are going to be there. And more so, this effect is more going to be in the emerging economies, because the emerging economy growth rates are actually revised downwards by about 1 percentage point as compared to lesser amount, even though the growth differences are still, emerging economies have a higher growth, but we have a situation where emerging economies have also lost the growth. So if we are thinking about what happened with the pandemic and how do we go forward, we are in this position where we have this issue that on an average, the next decade is going to see lower growth. That has its own ramifications. And this performance is divergent across countries. And the right-hand chart, you would see that, the IMF's projection about different countries' growth rates, and you see that India is an outlier, but most countries are this year and next year are going to be around 3.5, and the global growth is going to be 3% this year and next year. So that's where we are in terms of global growth. And then the next thing is inflation. And you would remember, or those who have read would know that there was this whole, thinking about that inflation has died with better monetary policy frameworks. Technology is giving you lower prices. There were a lot of reasons why inflation was thought to be down and out. But then, inflation came back, and in a way that people were, usually the US Federal Reserve initially said that it's transitory, and the transitory word became permanent. And then the inflation was never coming down, and then they realized that we have to raise it, and did raise their rates, and they raised it much faster. And over the last 1 year, you see that the inflation has started coming down, both in the advanced economies and somewhat in emerging economies, maybe a little bit less in Indian case. But what you see is that inflation has fallen, but the policymakers are not yet sure whether this fall in inflation is sustainable or not. And one of the reasons why policymakers are still apprehensive whether inflation fall that you're seeing globally is sustainable or not is because the core component of inflation is sticky. That is that component. I don't know, you guys are familiar with headline and core inflation, right? But why, I have a question. Why is the headline inflation called headline? This is a trivia question. We all call it headline inflation, but why is it called headline? It's called headline because that's the one which is reported in the headline of newspapers. Okay, so for the core inflation, core inflation is ideally that component of inflation which is more sensitive to aggregate demand changes and amenable to monetary policy, is still yet to come down to levels that central banks and policymakers would like to be. So that means that even though much of the decline in inflation is driven by the goods component, the services component and core inflation across the globe, India, we have a different story, which we'll talk about when we come to India, is actually on a higher plane, which means that going down from here further down to 2%, which is the target of most of these economies, would be difficult, because if you don't get the underlying pressure of inflation down, the goods component has moderated, but it could still spill over, and you could have, so that's, you could have pressure. So that's why people talk about the last mile being the most difficult one. You know, our governor also spoke about the last mile being the most difficult one in the journey to disinflation. So that's where the global inflation story stays. Come to financial markets. Financial markets are really behaving in a way that policymakers are finding it difficult to understand. Say, you know, March, April, we had this this episode where the banks were failing. You had, you know, credit issue and all that. Financial market conditions were tightening. But then, even as monetary policymakers are raising rates, financial markets, global financial markets were going up, right? So, and everybody was talking about recession, but markets were just discounting about it and going up. And now you see the last point, that you will see the equity market indices are kind of coming down, partly reflecting the fact that they are also trying to, you know, imbibe into the fact that the soft landing is not going to be so soft. There could be a hard landing, or the global economy is going to slow. So financial markets are very volatile as we speak. Say yesterday, Powell spoke at the Jackson Hole. He said that we would do whatever it takes to bring inflation back to 2%. The same thing that he said last year. And imagine the life of central banks. They have to say the same thing again and again till it happens, and wish that it happens. Please don't quote me. Right. So that's where the global financial markets are, and the bond markets in the U.S. have a yield curve inversion, where the you know, long-term rates are lower than the short-term rates, usually the other way around, which means that going forward, either the market agents are expecting that the economic conditions to worsen, or they are expecting that the situation would be such that the rates would be cut faster, so they don't price it into future. So that's why I said, like, you know, when you say that there is a bond curve inversion, why or what is what we should be talking about. And the way I've kind of kept my talk is to kind of talk through these issues, which often you don't get to hear. Now, if that's the case, central banks have raised rates. They've raised it at much faster pace than they've done in the last 2-3 decades. And of late, they have taken off the pedal. So you would see that the various quarters, how much they have raised is there in the chart. And you can see that, you know, in the latest quarter, not many people have raised the rates, because they're kind of waiting and watching how much of the effect of past monetary policy actions are feeding through the system. Inflation is falling. Even though core is still sticky, inflation is falling. We want to kind of see how much more the effect is going to work through, and wait and watch. And that is kind of reflected in policy documents also. But most of the central banks are putting together a hawkish policy stance in terms of their communication to say that if inflation were to go back, we would raise rates again. So that means that even central banks are open to further tightening, one of the largest tightening cycles that we have seen in the last 30 years, but central banks are still open to further monetary policy tightening. So this is what is happening to global economy as such. So you have growth slowing, inflation coming down, not so core, financial markets edgy, central banks are playing a wait and watch game. And that's where we are. So in this environment, how is Indian economy doing? You know, that's something which we would be now talking about. In terms of growth, we were one of the economies to get the maximum hit, and we were the fastest to recover. And that's kind of obvious, because we gave all this stimulus, fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, we discussed in detail, and then we saw that the effect of that was the Indian economy has recovered in a way that took many by surprise. And one of the things that was even more surprising is that the resilience of the recovery has been stronger. If you remember the global growth chart, you saw that went up, down, and then it's now going down. Whereas in the Indian case, it went up, down, and now you see that chart, it's kind of the resilience is there, right? So Indian economy is showing quite a bit of resilience, and as the previous speaker said that the forecast for this year is 6.5%, which is one of the largest growth among the major economies in the world. And, India is going to contribute 2.8 times of its share to world growth now. That means that we are growing disproportionately than in this year. The estimate is that India's contribution will be 2.8 times the world share of GDP. So ideally, if everybody is growing together, everybody's share would be equal to their share in world GDP. But India is disproportionately contributing to global growth. So that's our story of resilient growth. And our growth is always dependent on monsoon. What's happening to monsoon now? You remember the June was very, very weak. We were having a lot of apprehensions about how the monsoon would turn around, but monsoon has caught up. Along with that, our sowing has improved substantially, even though there are crops in which we still have a deficit to catch up. But as compared to what we were looking at 2 months ago, things are much better. But the August rainfall has not yet been satisfactory. The El Nino conditions remain very much a risk of that. So going forward, monsoon, the remaining trajectory of the monsoon, as well as how El Nino plays out during the rest of the year, would be things which would occupy the policymakers' mind quite a lot. So that's where we are in terms of our agricultural output. And agriculture is an important sector, both in terms of livelihood that we are looking at for the larger population, as well as its spillover effects to the rest of the economy. So that's where agriculture is. Inflation, and that after coming down since for about a year, we had a general falling of inflation, and then when inflation went up substantially in the latest month in July. I hope you all follow the news and all that. So, and if you see that the all of that uptick is actually coming from the food side, right? And one of the things that is very interesting is that globally core is sticky, and the headline is falling. We are in a situation where our core is falling and headline is going up. So that means that our inflation is now driven more by supply side factors, because the changes, relative price of food is going up because of supply side issues. And that's one of the reasons why you see such a change happening right now. So that's where the story of the inflation is. And if you see the contribution charts, you can see that the blue bars is actually coming down a bit, and all of the pickup is coming from the green bar, which is nothing but the contribution of food to overall inflation. Now, one of the things that I want to kind of highlight is that much of this increase in inflation was driven by the temporal short-term spikes that happened to vegetable prices, especially tomato prices. Yeah, right? Yeah, everybody knows how, because all of us paid a lot and people were buying ketchups to substitute for tomato, and all kinds of behavioral things were happening. So let's just look at this. This is how much prices changed in a month and how much prices changed on a year-on-year basis as compared to last year. I didn't make a mistake by keeping a lot of white spaces in the chart. If you look at the top right corner, you would see vegetables sitting there, right? Can you see that on that top right channel? So that's how much disproportionately vegetables contributed to the overall inflation in July, the latest month. And as I said, tomatoes were the major driver of that. Now, let's slice into tomato prices. So this is an exercise which we did in the State of the Economy, I think the last month. So you can see that tomato prices usually follow a very cyclical pattern, like 2-3 months, because it's a very short-term crop. And once in a while, it just goes up like anything. And then this current phase, as you can see, has been the largest that we have seen ever in terms of both the magnitude of increase and the speed at which it went up. You can see that, right? In that left chart, the blue line, it went up. But you look carefully, the way it's coming down is also the speed at which it went up. Now you can see that the blue line actually has a kink and it's almost touching that. So that means the supply response has been quite strong. But there are two things that I just want to highlight from our research. One is that if you take the cycles, you see that over the years, the trough has always been the same at the wholesale market. Like, the lowest price that the farmers were getting in the market has always been around 10 rupees. Whereas subsequent years, the peaks are going up, which means that the supply chains are getting tight, whereas the farmers are not really getting a lot of money. And then if you look at the last part, you see that the periods for which the prices remain above 40 could be like 2.7 fortnights, which is about 45 days, whereas the periods for which the price remain below 20 is like 10 fortnights. That means that quite a lot of time farmers get prices which are much lower. So that's why the supply is not coming forth. So these are the kind of research that we do to support in terms of, providing information that would help the overall policymakers. So that's what is happening to tomato prices. We hope that fall that we have started seeing would lead to, prices coming down quite a lot, and we will see the inflation coming down as we move forward. Now, let's talk about government expenditure. This is something which Dr. Rath and Professor Bhanumurthy has covered very eloquently over a long time, so I'm not going to go into details, but the matter that we need to be looking at is that the quality of expenditure has gone up. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is that how does the quality of expenditure lead to higher investment? This is kind of an extension of, I thought I'll just talk about it in 2 minutes. It's a kind of an extension of what Professor Bhanumurthy said. Why would private investment increase for an increase in public investment? So if you think about saving investment identity, it's always national saving is equal to national investment, and then the rest is current account deficit. That's the twin deficit channel that you know. So if that is the case, then why would public investment lead to higher private investment? So if you think about private investment, and if you think about the investment demand function, private investment is a function of R is equal to MPK, marginal productivity of capital. So you are going to equate your rate of interest, which is the cost that you pay for investment, to the marginal productivity of capital. So if private investment is always looking to equate R is equal to MPK, then what happens is that when public investment in infrastructure and other facilities go up, the marginal productivity of capital, what happens to that? That increases. So if marginal productivity of that capital increases, then that means that you would be willing to pay a higher price for the same level of investment. That means at the same level of price, you would do more investment. And that's the channel through which, because most often people don't understand what's the micro foundation of crowding in. And people usually don't teach also in classrooms. So this is the channel or the micro foundation of crowding in. That is that R is equal to MPK, and the MPK is a function of the level of public capital available. When this goes up, then correspondingly your MPK goes up. That means that at the current level of R, you would increase your level of investment. So that's how the mechanism that Professor Bhanumurthy was telling you works. And again, this is a exposition of how or for what. So that's why people don't often kind of appreciate these things. So I thought I'll just tell you how this works. Now let me just go forward. So expenditure quality has gone up, both at the center and state level. I don't want to cover this because we have talked about this quite a lot. Now let me just talk to you about something which is happening at the trade level. Post-COVID, there was an increase in trade activity because everything was shut down, opened, everybody started trading. But then over the last 1 year, there has been a decline in trade. Both our imports and exports have been falling, and that you know. And here, one thing which we need to remember is that the price effect, the trade overall number is a combination of both price effect and the quantity effect. And most of the fall in import values and export values are actually contributed by the price effect. Because globally, after the Ukraine crisis, commodity prices had gone up substantially, say during the March to June period, and have corrected very significantly thereafter. So the impact of that, say for example, India exports a lot of finished petroleum products. Our petroleum exports realizations in terms of value has come down because the global oil prices had fallen. Recently they have risen, but on an average they've been increasing all this while and then falling subsequently. So the price effect is a major player, but overall, there has also been a slowdown in trade activity. Global WTO has actually forecasted that the global trade could grow hardly by 1%. And if the global trade in itself is growing at 1% this year, then there's only so much we can grow when the aggregate is growing at such a tepid pace, right? So that's the overall picture about the global trade activity, and that is reflecting in our own trade numbers also. But in terms of our macro fundamentals on the external sector, you remember in our inaugural lecture, our honorable, I think, our Vice-Chancellor was talking about the foreign exchange reserves being just enough for 3 weeks of imports. Now we have enough for 9.5 months of imports. And it has gone up to more than $600 billion. And the thing is that we have had a decline up to September 22, but most of that decline has been arrested now. And we have built up foreign exchange reserves. And one of the things that makes this interesting is that this has also happened in a period where rupee as a currency remained one of the least volatile. On the right-hand side, you would see that how much each currency has moved against the US dollars over the years, and you see that shaded one, I know it's the shade is not that visible, but you can see that India's currency movement has been one of the least in this period. So that gives us comfort saying that we've been able to build up our reserves and also keep our currency relatively stable. And what makes a country stand out in terms of an attractive source of investment and all that is whether they have enough reserves to withstand a crisis, which we didn't have when we were faced with the taper tantrum, but we now have. And also, is your currency relatively stable so that someone who invests does not have to worry about the volatility in the currency market. So in that sense, we are at a point where our currency is actually relatively stable, and our foreign exchange reserves are increasing. So we are in a sweet spot in that sense. And you look at the external sector vulnerability indicators. Some of these have been briefly talked about by the previous speakers. Say, for example, India's reserves to external debt data. Tomorrow, if somebody comes, all of the world comes and tells you, give me my money, do you have enough reserves to pay them? Yes, we have increased. So the blue line, light blue bar is the one when we were at the taper tantrum, and now with the darkest one is our latest numbers. So you can see that we have improved our reserves to external debt ratio, our debt service ratio, that how much of your debt it needs to be serviced on an ongoing basis, that has come down. Our short-term debt to reserves ratio, that means short-term debts are those debt commitments which needs to be serviced in the short term, that has gone up, that has gone down. And our external debt to GDP ratio has gone down, and it is one of the lowest among comparable countries. And then you can see that a cross-country comparison shows India is somewhere in the middle, and for most of the variables, reserves to external debt ratio, we are one of the highest. So that means that in terms of external sector vulnerability, our performance has been much better than a decade ago when a global crisis, a global factor like the taper tantrum led to a kind of a large depreciation of our currency, a huge current account deficit, higher inflation, and had multiple effects which led to even a series of problems for our macroeconomy. So we are much better placed in terms of our external sector. Now, monetary policy cannot be talked about without looking at what's happening to credit and money. Credit growth has been very strong. The red line shows that it's been in double digits. That means that credit is actually flowing into the productive sectors of the economy. And your aggregate deposits have been growing strong, partly driven by the increase in interest rates that has happened in the economy. So that's kind of giving you a boost to aggregate deposits. So the credit is actually funded by savings. So that's the message that comes from there, that your higher credit is now getting increasingly funded by the savings that is coming from the economy. And the reserve money growth has not been that great, that large, which also tells you that money, we are in an anti-inflationary environment and monetary policy is trying to keep inflation stable. And in that case, if your base money is growing, reserve money is growing, then you have a contradiction. So such contradiction is not there. Our reserve money growth is contained. In that sense, we have a stable environment from the monetary side also. Equity markets, you might be following that, Sensex hit a new high and all that. There are two important players in equity market. One is the domestic investors, and the other is foreign investors. Historically, there was a time when whenever foreign investors withdraw money from Indian markets, all domestic investors will panic and then they would withdraw money. So that's why historically there was a lot of volatility in the equity markets. But now you see the blue line is the foreign investors, FPI flows, and then the mutual fund flows are yellow. They're doing a contra movement, right? Whenever foreign investors are withdrawing, domestic people are actually buying the stocks, which means that our volatility is much less, and it also provides our resilience to markets to external shocks. And a lot of active participation of retail investors in the stock market is also providing some kind of resilience to our stock market in that sense. So, and people are more optimistic about India's long-term prospects. That's why whenever there is a fall, people are actually, this is the opportunity to buy. All right. FPI and FDI flows to India. India has been one of the, largest, even though FDI has been coming down, this is a global trend. Most of the foreign direct investment has been kind of falling, but in terms of the foreign portfolio investors, equities of peer economies, if you see that there has been an increase in Indian equity inflows quite a lot. So that means that the outside there is, whole world is looking for some bright spot because there's a lot of money flowing around. They want to see where we can see maximum growth in future. And they see India as one of the bright spots and, which is actually attracting a lot of investment. And that is kind of good for us because that provides us with the capital that we need. So that's the kind of story. So, okay, like we're about halfway through our talk. Let me just tell you what I talked about the state of the economy. So what's the summary? Global growth is slow. Inflation is not yet tamed. So I'm just going to tell you one word about what we have heard so far. Growth in India, macro fundamentals drive the strength, but external headwinds are quite strong. Inflation, there has been a moderation, especially on the core, but if you look at the supply shocks, like the vegetables, is adding a lot of volatility. Fiscal, quality of expenditure has gone up, and you remember the previous two presentations are talking about debt levels are still high. We are committed to bringing it down to 60, but we are still at 80s, and that's quite a lot of decline that you need if you really want to be, following the path that you have committed to. External sector, less vulnerable from our own side, but slowing external demand and increasing number of external pressures have led to a situation where we have to navigate choppy water with a better ship, right? And perhaps that's the way we should put it, because we have built our strength so that now we are more prepared to go through the choppy water in a way and a better shape. Now, banking, we have strong credit growth, but there are some sectoral weaknesses like industrial credit is falling, but then overall we are still doing fine. So if you want to know what is the state of the economy in terms of your assessment, everything is here in one slide, and I just put a bit of time to put it together so that you get an idea of what we are talking about, and you don't forget when you go out, right? And then let me just talk about thinking about the medium term. That's going to be something where I'm going to spend a bit of time on talking to you about some of the medium-term challenges that we are going to face as we move out of a pandemic-struck world. One of the things that we need to be worried about is that the world, in terms of its openness, is changing. There's a new word which came out of the IMF. I think it came out a couple of days ago, and they've called it from globalization to slowbalization. And the chart on your left is the world export and imports as a percentage of GDP, which is the degree of openness that you can think of, that exports and imports put together, how much of it is as percentage of GDP. And you would see that the first red, black period is the period of industrialization, which was from 1817 to 1914, where there was an increase in the debt to GDP, overall export-import to, or openness to GDP levels. But then you had the two great world wars, World War I and World War II, and economies became increasingly closed, and you had a deglobalization, where countries became more inward-looking. That was from 1914 to 1945. Between 1945 and up to early 80s, you had this fixed exchange rate regime, and countries were trying to compete with each other, and then you had this gradual increase, and then we had the flexible exchange rate, trade openness, globalization, liberalization, privatization, and then you had this huge increase in the share of export and imports in world GDP. But then you come to 2008 crisis, and then post-crisis, you get that increase has kind of slowed down. Now you have a situation where the share of export and import as a percentage of GDP has slowed down. And a lot of that is not behavioral, it is policy driven. And if you see the right-hand chart, what you see is that the number of restrictions, these lines are the number of import restrictions, and these are a percentage of G20 imports. So the number of trade restrictions that different countries have put in has gone up exponentially over these years. So a lot of the slowdown in openness across the globe is actually driven by policies which are partly also driven by the discontents to globalization. Marginalized sections of the societies feel that they've been left out from globalization's benefits, so it is reflecting in the political choices that they make. A lot of factors are at play. And there has been a realization in many countries that they have not benefited as much from globalization as they thought, so they're taking their feet off the pedal, and that's kind of leading to a situation where there is an increased, kind of going back to protectionism, some of which that is seen even in our own country. So that's kind of slowing the global trade in that way. And if you see part of the slowdown in global trade that we saw in the Indian case, Indian trade, that could also be attributed to that. Now, if this is a medium-term challenge, where are we placed? So one is that this world is increasingly becoming isolated, trade blocks, friend-shoring. There are a lot of words that you hear that, we don't want to do everybody, we only want to have friends. But then if that's not going to be the best outcome that we can think of, right? So if that's the case, then where we are. The other important problem or the important issue that we would be facing as we move ahead would be the geopolitical risk. So we thought that the world, there won't be any war. And I don't think, I didn't expect that there was going to be a war in 2022. Did any one of you expect that there was going to be a full-blown war, especially when the world is coming out of the pandemic? And geopolitical risks are back. And those spikes are the initial ones are like the red line is the geopolitical risk index, which was an American Economic Review paper in 2022. And you see that the risk is very prominent and it is above average. And, it's creating a lot of channels. And one of the things that we need to think about is that unlike in a, say, 50-year ago world or 100-year ago world, if two countries went on war, like we didn't have to worry much. Russia and Ukraine, who cares? Like, because India is, but now things are not like that. The integration is sending contagion channels through commodity prices. Russia is stopping Ukraine's grain supply. Russia's oil supply has been stopped by other countries. All of that. Putin declared war, and all of us are paying, isn't it? So that means that there are multiple contagion channels that are coming in, which is a great challenge as we move forward. Even in banking sector, say for example, this is a research that the IMF has done where they show that the geopolitical risk increases the funding cost of domestic banks because access to foreign funds, which at lower cost becomes lower now. So that leads to higher funding costs for domestic banks, more for banks in emerging economies, because they are the ones who have that arbitrage which is higher. So that means that there are multiple channels through which geopolitical risks are feeding into economies, which is creating further complications as we move forward. This is a major medium-term challenge and we need to navigate through. I'm not going to talk about the policy options because that's beyond the purview of this talk. So let's keep in mind that globalization and geopolitical risks are that something which we have to take it as given and need to navigate through. All is not lost. One of the gains that you are actually seeing when we are thinking about from how far things are coming from the global economy is there is a conscious effort to diversify supply chains, especially after the crisis during the post-pandemic period, especially when China shut down, the whole world had to suffer. So now this is a result from a survey done by Ernst & Young among the global manufacturing leaders, and most of them say that they want to diversify and segment suppliers. So that means that global supply chain is now actively seeking out to become more diversified. And India, with its natural advantage of labor and cheap manufacturing facilities, should be able to reap the benefits of that. And the government's capacity expansion in terms of capital expenditure, much of that is what is there in this slide. The India map, you can see that national corridors have been developed in terms of road networks. New airports are being built, new ports are being built. All of this would enable us to cater to this global demand for diversification of supply chains. And that would kind of act as a catalyst if we really are able to put in policies that can make sure that things can be improved and cater to a global market which is looking for quality, speed, and efficiency. So, and this thrust on capital expenditure by the government could help us cater to that increasing global demand for diversifying supply chains. That's something which comes as an opportunity as we look at this from this point of view. Now let me just go forward and talk about something which is happening inside, which is a demographic dividend. And this chart is the working age population ratio. That means if you take 100 people, how many are working? Some will be in school, some will be who would have retired, and then you have the rest who are working. And ideally for an economy to prosper, you need a larger share of population who are in the working age, which is 15 to 64. This is the world as it stands now. So I put world high income countries, China and India. this is how the world is going to be. In the world in the next 50 years, there's going to be a fall, general fall in the working age population ratio. Where is it coming? Most of it is coming in high income countries because they are aging very fast and really fast. China, which was driving the most of the increase in world worker population, working population, what is going to happen to China? China is also going to kind of plateau and fall now. But what's going to happen to India? India is going to be the net addition to the worker age population as we go forward. So this gives us the demographic dividend. So how does this dividend translate to? So this gives you more hands at work, and also in terms of the global working population share. If you think about labor as a resource, so we look at, and this is going to be an information age, right? Like if the previous prosperity revolution was driven by industry, the next revolution in the AI world is going to be driven by the human capital, because it's going to be information age. And we have the largest addition that is coming. The middle one, the purple one, is India, and you can see that India's share in global working age population is going to go up. So that means that if we can put in the right policies, we are standing to benefit from this huge resource at a time when this resource is becoming increasingly important in a global economy. So that's kind of something that we should be thinking about as an opportunity. But when we think about that, we should also think about investing in human capital. This is manufacturing value added per employee in different countries, and you see that the India one is the red one. I think in that chart you can see that, and India is about $8,000, whereas even our comparative countries like Malaysia is like $34,000. So our manufacturing per worker productivity is much lower. Two reasons that you can think about are there in the next two charts. One is our share of employees in elementary occupations. So those occupations which does not require any education is one of the highest. So India is that red dot in the middle chart. We need to move that share down. That means that our occupations have to be generated where you need to move towards middle, where your share of elementary occupations come down. And then the second thing is the share of employees who are technicians and associated professionals. That's very low in India. So we need to raise them, right? The technicians, the ones who are more productive. So this transformation, unless it happens, we would stand to lose even though we have this large human capital. So that's something which we need to think about actively for policies, and government has been taking a lot of initiatives which should translate to a larger, benefit as we go forward. So that's something which we need to think about as we are moving forward. And to raise productivity. Because, what are the three sources of growth? Anybody who has done macro growth? What are the three sources of growth? Fundamental sources of growth. Anything that you talk about ultimately has to come back to these three. Solar model, how can you grow? Labor, capital, and which is nothing but TFP, right? So labor, capital, and technology. We have investment in capital driven by government, policy on capex and all that. We have huge demographic dividend. But unless we improve our productivity, which is reflected in TFP, we will not be able to achieve the maximum benefit. So we should also be talking about TFP. So see, even in my presentation, I'm following the structure of a standard undergrad way of understanding economics. And that's the beauty of economics. At the end of the day, you cannot break it down to very simple things. Like all of this is like nothing but labor, capital, and technology. So you see the growth in TFP, which is the technology growth, which was achieved by different countries in their highest growing phase. Say, for example, France, when it was growing during 1955 to 73, their TFP on an average grew at 3.5% per annum. And in the largest increasing point of view, time period of us, we had hardly 1.7%. See, we have not yet been able to generate a growth that is technical progress driven. And that's where the policy focus has to be if we want to really look at India becoming an advanced country in say, 2047, our India at 100 project. By the way, a lot of this has been discussed in one of the articles that was published in RBI's July monthly bulletin. It's called India at 100. They have charted out a clear path of what are the policy options that we have. It would be nice for you to have a good read on it. It kind of systematically approaches on what are the factors that could drive India's growth as we go forward, thinking about the target of becoming a developed nation or an advanced country in the next 25 years. But the major challenge that we face in this pursuit is that the COVID has also had an impact on our productivity also. So you see the last 2 years, the TFP growth is now contributing negatively to overall growth, which is partly because of the TFB being measured as a residual, but nonetheless, the need for raising total factor productivity is very, very high. So that's something. And finally, when we are doing all this, let me also tell you that we need to be mindful of our aspirations and its impact on climate. And climate change is a reality. Those who wished that it didn't happen are now thinking that we wished we never wished that, right? So if you want to grow more, you end up polluting more. If you don't want to consume anything, the earth is fine, but you are all dead. So that's the trade-off that I'm going to talk about. So this is our emissions that has been happening so far. So I'm going to give you a few scenarios. First scenario is that if India grows at 6.5%, the average growth that we've been having, and we don't do anything about changing our decline in energy intensity, our energy intensity has been falling. That means that the 1 unit of energy that is used for producing output has been falling at 2.3%. And we've also been increasing our carbon absorption by increasing forestation and all that. Current policies follow. This is the way our emissions are going to go up, right? Now wait for suppose if we double our efforts to reduce our energy intensity and double our efforts to increase our carbon absorption capacity, our emissions would be lower. Now the third case, that we want to grow at say 9%, 9.6%, become an advanced country in the next 25 years without doing anything for energy, without doing anything for absorption of carbon. We will go for this as our emissions. But if we double our efforts on energy intensity decline and double our efforts on increasing carbon absorption capacity and try to grow at 9.6%, there would be some increase because we are trying to grow faster, but still at the end of the day, you will come back. Basically, I just told you the story that this trade-off has to be managed very delicately, that while you're trying to grow faster, you also need to be mindful of the impact of that is going to have on your overall economy. So that's something which is a challenge that we should all be mindful of. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. And if we are thinking about how the world is going to be in the next 25, 30 years, this is going to be how the world economy is going to be in 2050. I know that the numbers are a little dark. So what I'm saying is that India would be, as per the Goldman Sachs estimate, India would be the third largest economy in terms of its overall size. Right now we are the fifth, but we are something around 3.3 or 3.8 trillion, but we will be close to 25 trillion. So we are going to be 10 times more. This is an economy which is on its ascent. China has its own labor problems. Advanced economies are finding their own issues, a lot of this. But I hope that the fundamentals of economics tells us that this is India's age, and you as young people are the ones who have to carry it forward. And I hope, the lessons that you learn of collective responsibility, collective action, mindful of the environment, thinking about the larger questions of equality would help you foster this transition in a more inclusive way. With this, happy Onam and thank you.
Check. Sairam sir, thank you for giving such an insightful lecture on this. You said that growth, the variables for growth were labor capital and technical innovations and all. But the next slide you said about the pollution and the environmental effect. So why don't we consider those environmental effect also as a variable in that?
Okay, so, environment is something which is given. So what happens is that in environment, you cannot increase the productivity of environment. What you're doing is not destruct it, right? So there is a difference between thinking about, okay, I cannot make it nature more productive. I can make it less inefficient. So in that sense, the answer to your question would be that a lot of the current policies don't internalize the negative effects that we are putting on environment, which would later come back as lower productivity. Say, for example, repeated climate events, destroying capital. What would it lead to? It will lead to fall in aggregate productivity, right? So in that sense, this is a problem of internalization of those long-term effects. But then within the framework, it still holds, because your TFP is also a function of the stock of natural resources that you have. So if you end up, so then in terms of understanding, you can still use the framework rather than adding it as the external one. You can think about a production function where, energy, material, and services are 3 extra factors of production, but it doesn't really give you much mileage in terms of understanding this, because you can still, kind of reduce it and abstract it into the TFP that we are talking about. I hope it's clear. The whole thing is that we cannot increase the productivity of nature. What we are always doing is, making it fall or repair something which has already happened.
About increasing the productivity of nature, I would like to tell the example of this area.
Yeah.
That our Swami was there, was physically there, and he actually planted a lot of trees over a barren mountain. And he just converted the whole mountain itself to a good climatic. If you visit there, you won't be able to think that it was like that.
Yeah, so the damage that was caused to environment through maybe like policies of the past has now been kind of mitigated. So that's giving you the extra effect.
Thank you, sir.
No. Excellent question. Thank you.
Sairam sir.
Yeah. Sure.
So you were mentioning about India is now enjoying the demographic dividend.
Yeah.
Can you share your views about brain drain that is happening?
Okay, so brain drain, yeah, it is an important issue. So what we think about is that, a lot of people who go abroad and they don't come back. So India is facing a shortage of quality of human labor. By one who came back, so I shouldn't be talking about brain drain because I came back, right? So the thing is that, yeah, it is an issue, but at the end of the day, if an Indian can think about the similar levels of living, similar levels of life, work conditions, comforts, being abroad and here, anybody would prefer India, right? So one of the ways to stop brain drain would also be that, and it would stop. The number of people who are coming back to India has increased in some time. So that's one aspect that I would say. And I would say that, it's actually a kind of a misplaced emphasis also to some extent. I know it's going to be a bit controversial, and these are my personal views, but the very idea of I can go abroad is making a lot of people study. So if 10 people study to go to MIT, one goes, 9 stays in India, and their output is coming into India. And there is actually research, there's a work in one of the top 5 journals which shows that in Philippines, when the US opened up a lot of opportunities for nurses from Philippines, that actually led to increased supply of nurses in Philippines also, because everybody started studying nursing. So then there was a higher. So the net effect, without thinking about the general equilibrium effects, might look like that there is a negative thing, but we don't really know, because you could have these incentives driving people to work, study harder. The incentive that everybody is going abroad, I should also go abroad, makes me study harder. And I myself is now not going, but that means that India is getting because somebody else went. Looking at that, I studied and I am contributing to India. That cannot be kind of discounted, is something which I want to kind of tell. This is a perspective which often people don't talk about when the discussion on brain drain happens.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, there's one more.
Saram, sir. Wonderful presentation. I want to just, of course, there are a lot of optimistic views, but I want to just a little bit of pessimistic. Of course, I'm not negative, but few concerns which coming out from the pandemic perspective. One biggest issue, which the digital divide, which is another, and unemployment, which is again service-driven economy. There are a lot of unemployment which is happening because, as you have already talked about demographic dividend and all this, but if you see the unemployment numbers, it's not quite positive at all. That is another. And another aspects which I read nowadays is, for example, GDP, the number itself. The GDP is driven by, again, 166 people in our country. They're billionaires and they can actually drive the GDP numbers. So how long we can keep trusting on these GDP numbers itself is questionable, because a lot of all other negative things is happening. And on the other hand, that's what the demographic dividend, though we have a lot of young people, but GDP, there is no growth opportunities, and young people are, as the brain drain, a lot of people are going outside, and that is a huge loss. How you see and what's your view about this? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, all of these questions are very very valuable, and these needs to be looked at. And I'm not saying that we can only be optimistic without looking at the reality. We need to look at, say, you brought in the question of inequality, which is addressed, which needs to be addressed. Unemployment, yes, that is something which is very much the need of the hour, because if you can't provide employment, there is no value for growth. But having said that, I would see that over the last 20 years, India has made tremendous progress. So we were talking, and Anup said that in the last 20 years that he has left not only the area around here, the whole of drive from Bangalore to here. What Anup was telling me was that there is a significant change in the way the place looks. There are more buildings, better roads, and all that. All this works together, and the policymakers' challenge is to make sure that everything works together and the benefits is shared by all, and which is a challenge that needs to be addressed. And I hope the public policymakers are cognizant of this, and we need to discuss this, because if I were to be asked to talk about distributional challenges of growth, I would have talked about these issues. But everybody has a certain set on which we are talking about, and of course and digital divide, yes, but because digital divide is there, We need to we think about the remedial measures than thinking about should we stop UPI. If we stopped UPI thinking that half of Indian population is illiterate, now aren't illiterate people using UPI? I'm sure there would have been people who learned to read English because they had to use UPI. So sometimes technology in itself will drive inclusion, right? Prosperity will come that way. So there are efforts on both ways, but which one should take precedence is public policy makers' job. But it is not to stop digital progress. It is to make sure that you have financial education, you have other education, which makes that the digital divide is not leading to a digital exclusion. So that's the challenge of public policy, I would say. But your questions are very valid, and the concerns are to be taken up, and the policymakers are taking that up.
Our sincere thanks to Dr. Nadhanael sir for this session. Your panoramic insights into the global and Indian economy, coupled with thought-provoking perspectives, were inspired. Thank you, sir, for coming to Prasanthi Nilayam and for being with us today. We have token of appreciation for sir. May I request our Controller of Examinations, Sri Sanjay Sahni sir, to hand over our token of appreciation to Dr. Nadhanael GV.
Om Shri Sai Ram. I offer my reverential pranams at the divine lotus feet of our beloved Mother Sai, respected controller of examinations, revered elders, and all my brothers, Sai Ram, and good afternoon to one and all. It is my pleasant duty to introduce our next speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Ashima Goyal. This name is known amidst economic scholars and students in India and abroad. Ma'am is an Emeritus Professor at IGIDR and a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the RBI. Dr. Goyal's pivotal role in shaping India's economic policies is highlighted by her involvement in various capacities such as the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and her association as an expert in prestigious institutions such as ADB, UNDP, and the World Bank. Her academic distinctions included fellowships at Yale University and Claremont Graduate University. Dr. Goyal has garnered several awards, including accolades from GDN meetings, the Scott Challenger Award for Economic Policy, and the recognition as one of the most powerful women in economics today. She was recently honored by Times Group as one of the promising women leaders of India. Apart from this, Dr. Goyal is a luminary in areas of institutional and open economy macroeconomics with scores of contributions through her extensive publications. She has authored noteworthy books such as Macroeconomics and Markets in Developing and Emerging Economics, and a concise handbook of Indian economy in the 21st century, and has been an editor of the Routledge Journal, Macroeconomics and Finance in Emerging Market Economies. And without any further ado, may I now request ma'am to deliver her thoughts on the topic entitled India's monetary policy stance during and post-pandemic period.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm happy to be here with you. Although I've never visited Uttar Party, I've heard so much about, and I know of this place because one of my teachers was here, Dr. Pandit. V.N. Pandit, I'm sure you all know him, and one of my students, Prashant Parab. So I've heard a lot about you, and I know that you do good work. So the topic today, and this is a very apt session on macro stabilizations, different sessions that you have. I'll be talking about monetary policy. So can you see my slide?
Yes, ma'am, yes.
I'm putting it on slideshow, right? Yeah. So this has been a very
Excuse me, ma'am.
exciting period. I joined the MPC in 2020 at the height of the COVID pandemic. It's been a
Excuse me,
very
ma'am.
challenging time. Yes.
Uh,
Any problem?
Yeah, this is not in the slideshow.
What is not in the
We can see in the full window screen, but it's not in the slideshow. I mean, screening properly.
It is, I've selected slideshow. It's showing slideshow here.
It's not
You
showing.
can't see the slides?
We can see, but it's in a not full screen.
Okay, let me see what you can do. You can read the slides nevertheless, right? There doesn't seem to be any way to select,
Ma'am,
to select, yeah?
F5 will be the shortcut for that. F5.
F1.
F5. 5.
It's already selected slideshow in my laptop, and over here, once I share and go to the windows, there doesn't seem to be any option to select slideshow. I'll try once more to share. Okay, yeah. Now I'm going to Windows. So is this slideshow?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so, during this period, there's a lot of pessimism on the Indian economy. I mean, we have a lot of critics internally as well as externally, partly because for a long time, India has not lived up to its promise. So, a couple of years back, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to Angrist and company, microeconomists who work on inferring inferring certain results from specially set up microeconomic experiments. So in a way, as macroeconomists, it was an experiment, the kind of shocks the economy faced and the outcomes that we saw, from which we can infer certain, about how the economy is doing, what are the drivers of growth, etc. So it was a natural experiment, and we contrast the outcomes with the predictions, and that will tell us what the lacunae are in our understanding of the economy. So that is the angle from which I'll be approaching the question. We also look at some structural aspects of the economy to assess monetary actions in that context and compare this with the textbook sort of actions and what many major advanced countries were doing. So preconceptions and performance. So the perception that we had gone through a decade-long slowdown, and the general consensus was that you needed major reforms and structural changes to recover. And once the pandemic hit, the economy was expected to go into a deep slide, which would be very difficult to recover from. And the first quarter of the lockdown, we had very severe negative growth. But then over the year, if you compare with many other countries, we were actually not the worst hit. And we grew much faster in the recovery than countries that were the worst hit, even some of those figures are there on the slide, you can see. And that means it was not just the base effect. So the puzzle as an academic is that if major new reforms were required, then that's above good growth performance. Today we hear that India is one of the best performing countries in the world, is a puzzle. And then the government you'll often say that it is reforms we have done that are responsible. But if it was reforms that delivered, it's also a puzzle, because why didn't reforms are taking place through the 2010s and even earlier? So why didn't those deliver? So the thesis I take in this presentation and some papers I have written is that we actually saw a recovery of the 2010 slowdown in early 2020, because there was severe monetary tightening, financial tightening before that. And as this was reversed, in high frequency data, we saw a turnaround. There's a paper I have in EPW, but with the details, if anyone's interested. But then after that, the pandemic hit. So for people, it was that the economy was doing badly, it continued to do badly. Throughout, even in 2010s, starting with the global financial crisis, 2020s, there were major external shocks. But macroeconomic policy was pro-cyclical in the 2010s. There was no stabilization. There was over-stimulus and then over-tightening, which aggravated shocks. And the focus was on structural reforms, like setting up an inflation targeting regime, other kinds of reforms, but not on stabilization. So now the topic of your day-long discussions is macro stabilization. And I'm going to say that what we tried was stabilization finally in the 2020s, and it really worked, because stabilization tries to smooth the impact of shocks, right? To counter certain shocks. And this is what worked. But it wasn't just macroeconomic policies, but also complementary supply side reforms that were different from the liberalization that we are often advised to undertake, because this was in line with our comparative advantage of trends in technology and so on. So then I'm just going to briefly give a kind of example for what I suggest is what I think is the structure of the economy. Because of our really high numbers of population, 1.4 billion people, and a large number of young, our demographic profile, and transition from agriculture into more productive jobs, which means that you have a lot of unemployment. I think the last session someone raised this question on unemployment. So what this large unemployment suggests is that if you look at aggregate demand and supply, I'm sure you studied this in your macroeconomic class. So in looking at this in inflation and output space, you can have an aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve. Now we know that where there is unemployment, that L-shaped Keynesian curve, that the aggregate supply is flat. In the sense you can raise output without raising inflation, because wages, etc., don't rise. There is a lot of unemployment. So in India, I'm suggesting that aggregate supply is somewhat flat, while aggregate demand is downward sloping as the normal shape. But in addition to being flat, it's also volatile, or there is steady sort of cost push, as well as volatile shocks that raise inflation. Yeah, we know that we are an oil import dependent economy, that food is a large part of our consumption basket. Therefore, the consumer price index, the weight of food is almost 50. So whenever there is a monsoon failure, like just currently we are seeing that we saw the spike in tomato prices and how this pushes up inflation. So this is an example of how external shocks, as well as various inefficiencies, supply side bottlenecks, poor governance, that is chronic cost push, tends to raise costs and therefore push up so you have a flat but volatile aggregate supply subject to number of shocks. Now with such a framework, suppose you do the standard stabilization, that is inflation has gone up, so you need to decrease demand. So you raise interest rates or whatever, tighten fiscal policy to decrease demand. You're shifting the aggregate demand leftwards. What will be the impact on inflation and output? So if inflation is has risen because of the rise in costs, the supply shock, and you tighten demand, you'll have very little fall in inflation from the stabilization policies and a very large fall in output in this structure. So the output sacrifice of demand tightening of traditional stabilization is very large in a structure such as the Indian. So what are the kind of policies that would work here that would be effective against inflation? So this is policies that shift down this aggregate supply. Supply side policies like improving agricultural productivity, reducing infrastructure bottlenecks, or other efficiency improving policies that could bring down aggregate supply. Yeah. So what are the implications for monetary policy? Now we are in a flexible inflation targeting regime. So how does this regime fit this structure of the economy? As I said, policies work better if they shift down the supply curve. Traditional stabilization that shifts the aggregate demand leftward has a very high cost. Yeah. So for credible and very often when I present this structure, people say, then what is the role for monetary policy? Because traditional monetary policy works by reducing demand, raising interest rates that shifts demand leftward. But here, and Prashant has worked with me on this, is the expectations channel of transition. And what monetary policy can do is if you make sure that your policy rate exceeds expected inflation and keeps the real rate near the natural equilibrium interest rate, which changes in the cycle, it tends to be negative in a boom, negative in a slowdown, and positive in a boom, then you anchor inflation expectations. People know that they're not going to be facing very negative interest. Savers are not going to be disincentivized. People, who traders or producers are not going to be able to borrow at negative real interest and borrow too much and overheat the economy. Yeah. So this kind of monetary policy response helps because in large part of inflation targeting is managing expectations, as we'll see. So it helps to credibly anchor inflation expectations, and inflation expectations enter that aggregate supply. Because if inflation expectations and wages rise, aggregate supply is pushed upwards, inflation rises. So this kind of credible inflation targeting brings down the aggregate supply and reduces inflation. And why flexible? Because where you have these large shocks and they're not amenable to instant, they take time to work out through the economy. So you need a tolerance band, as we have. Many of you must have read the papers or seen RBI website, the details of our regime. We follow the Monetary Policy Committee targets inflation between 2 and 6%. Our target is 4%, but we have a tolerance band, plus minus 2% around that. And we have 3 quarters in which to bring inflation within this tolerance band. Yeah. And then our ultimate aim is to reach 4%, but there's no time limit on that. We can take as long as we like to get there. So this gives us room to accommodate supply shocks without being forced to contract demand very rapidly. Then inflation targeting is rule-like. It imposes we are accountable to the voters who are as principals, as policymakers, we are accountable to our agents. But we have operational freedom because this is a very complex kind of macroeconomy, huge number of variables enter and affect outcomes. And there is shared responsibility, different kinds of perspectives coming in, which helps in handling complexity. Moreover, inflation targeting is inherently forward-looking because the repo is determined based on expected inflation in the future. Since monetary policy acts with a lag, so if you change interest rates today, they will affect demand in the future. And this forward-looking behavior also helps to influences market expectations, industry expectations, etc. There's also a stance of policy, whether you're accommodative, tightening, which also communication and guidance to markets to the economic agents is a very important part of inflation targeting. And there is a forecast path, which MPC statement, some of you have read it. Every time we publish our expected path of inflation and growth over the next few months. And also what inflation targeting does is it condenses the guidelines, or the objective of the MPC is to keep inflation stable, bring inflation subject to growth. There's a concern for growth also. So we have two objectives, inflation and growth. And now let's see why communication is very important. Since markets are not perfect, they don't get things, future is not perfectly foreseen. There can be multiple equilibria. And although the textbooks talk about perfect competition and perfect market clearing, this is not observed in actual economies. And the features of these economies include dynamic change, learning, expectations are not rational, that is, they are not realized, that some agents have more information than others, and so on. So all this means that the central bank can help guide expectations towards the correct, the better equilibrium. Yeah. And in some research work, a number of papers have argued that this impact can be greater in emerging markets because there's less other news, and there's more hierarchy. So people pay more attention to what policymakers are saying, what the central bank is saying. So all this can help reduce inflation expectations, shift down that aggregate supply, reduce financial and inflation volatility. So this wasn't always the case. Inflation targeting became accepted as a dominant monetary policy paradigm. There was a shift sometime in the 1990s worldwide. Before that, there was what is called the real business cycle view, which is that only unanticipated money effects can affect output, and therefore surprise matters, and central banks must not communicate anything, and policy must surprise markets. So and an example of this is Greenspan. He was famous for talking under his, talking in a whisper and saying unintelligible things that nobody could understand. This was supposed to be the way central bankers spoke. But today, what dominates is the new Keynesian multiple equilibrium view. Bernanke is an exponent of that, as is Janet Yellen after that now. So they are very well-known theorists in this school of thought, as well as they were central bankers in the US. So this says that successful monetary policy is not so much controlling overnight interest rates as of affecting the evolution of market expectations. Yeah? But the other very important factor, apart from guiding expectations, if you have that sort of structure, is the importance of monetary and fiscal coordination. Especially since the supply side shocks dominate in an economy like India, then the fiscal policy can be more effective on the supply side. Government trading, stocking, buffer stock, procurement, and pricing policies affect food prices and therefore inflation. Yeah, much more directly than anything that the monetary policy can do. And this overall, if in a developing economy you have various bottlenecks and which raise inflation, high indirect costs, then continuous improvements, the ease of doing business, reducing the cost of doing business, all this reduces inflation. While so the coordination is that, and at the same time, because the quality of government fiscal expenditure also matters. If you're spending more on investment, on improving infrastructure, human and physical, that is going to reduce inflation, increase capacity over time, than if you are just making kind of transfers or spending for consumption. And also you need to be, because in a country like India, it's very, very important. We have a large very large population. So if you do those kind of like the advanced economies, they made huge transfers of money to people during the pandemic. And we have a lot of such subsidy programs. And in fact, we probably have too much more than we can afford because you have a very narrow tax paying base and you have large transfer programs. Then you don't have taxes, so it leads to huge fiscal deficits, which are a problem, increase inflation, as well as create volatility when you're an open economy, because you have a lot of outflows when they fear the deficits are going to rise too much, and then you get double deficits and so on. So if voided fiscal policy is conservative, acts on the supply side, has high good quality of expenditure, then monetary policy can keep real interest rates below growth rates. This is a big advantage economy like India has, that our growth rates are much higher because we're in a catch-up phase. But traditionally, our growth rates during the reform period since the 1990s have been high but very volatile. And you had periods where real interest rates rose very high because of over-tightening, because of exchange rate pressure, or whatever. And so then the real interest rate becomes higher than the growth rate. This reduces the fiscal space, the increase in tax revenues. Otherwise, this is known as the snowball effect, where real interest rates are less than growth, that fiscal deficits fall naturally as the denominator, as GDP rises. So therefore, smoothing these external and domestic shocks is essential to harness the snowball effect, which can help improve finances and provide funds for the economy to grow. So now I'll very briefly touch upon the 2010. Why did we go into this huge slowdown? In the 2010 and 2014, inflation targeting was introduced, and it followed a period of very high inflation and double deficits, huge fiscal as well as current account deficit, beginnings of large outflows, volatility in the early 2010s. So inflation targeting was thought to be a way to bring inflation down. It was implemented too strictly. Liquidity was also tightened. The banks were in trouble with large NPAs. And there was too much strictness in regulation also. So there was an overreaction, overstimulus after the global financial crisis, fragility, and then overreaction, too much fiscal, monetary, and regulatory tightening. So this was inflation targeting, not flexible inflation targeting. And it did not work. It led to really the credit growth just crashed. Growth crashed in 2019. We had very low growth, and our credit growth was half of what it is normally when the pandemic hit. But it wasn't just domestic policies that were the problem. It was also global, because after the GFC, we had large quantitative easing, what is called global risk on, risk off. Huge inflows would come in when global risk conditions were good, because interest rates were so low in advanced economy, they were searching for yield, looking for higher returns in developing economies. And we have some research in the recent global economic prospects from the World Bank also shows that for more than 50 emerging markets grew more slowly in the 2010s than they did in the 2000s. They bore a large, the global safety nets did not help them at all, did not help to moderate these shocks. So, and India was one of these economies whose growth rate really fell in that decade. And so this pro-cyclic, as we saw, our own policy aggravated these global shocks. But in the 2020s also, we had a succession of global shocks, the pandemic and the Ukraine war. But India, a lot of emerging markets and developing economies are in trouble with very high debt, etc. But India is doing relatively well. So why? So what was the post-pandemic policy like? Now, what is our experience with flexible? Now, we really demonstrated flexible inflation targeting in the post-pandemic period. And despite what this has come to be known as a period of poly shocks, that's a term that has been coined. And as I said, our band is 2 to 6%, and inflation has largely stayed within that band despite unprecedented once in 100 years pandemic and many kinds of supply shocks. And we were also able to have good growth so that India is regarded as a beacon in the world today, and as well as financial stability. So this is unlike IT, we showed that flexible inflation targeting is compatible with both growth, with attention to growth and financial stability. And overall, I just took the average, before coming to the session, I said, let me see what the average is. Like I joined this MPC this new MPC was set up with three new external experts in October 2020. So from November 2020 to July 2023, average headline inflation this MPC has delivered is 5.86, which is within that range. Yeah. And in a period of multiple supply shocks, we know that just after COVID-19, there were huge global supply chain disruptions and the cost push shocks. WPI inflation became much higher than consumer inflation. The decision then was that this is transient. It's a period when people are really suffering large unemployment, excess capacity. Growth was deeply negative. So it was very clear that you needed to support growth. And there was less attention paid to inflation. And the guidance was that inflation that has increased is a temporary spike that needs to be looked through, together with continuing supply side action. And time-based accommodation was given, which is almost the first time this was done in India. It's very difficult to do in a country where you have multiple shocks, and it was said that this accommodative policy would continue into the next year, and it was also along with state dependence, that is the outcomes on inflation and growth. So the average inflation in that year was 6.6. It was above our target, but there was a breakdown in the price series. So it was regarded as an exceptional period where that time the price data also was not available. 1 month there was a lockdown. So it was just a reset. We were asked to reset. Our 3 quarters started from after that. And in December 2020, inflation had fallen to 4.6 as oil prices fell, and there was some reversal of the supply side shocks. And over the whole of 2021, the inflation average was 5.14. We were doing well. We were going down, moving towards our target, which is 4%. And in preparation for, reversing the pandemic time, there's a huge liquidity influx also. So to withdraw that liquidity is not so easy. 11 lakh crores or something of liquidity was injected in the economy, as well as interest rates cut in accommodation. So since April 21, so it is forward-looking policy, there were moves to the CRR cut was reversed, then a standing facility, moves to develop a standing facility which should make it possible to absorb liquidity without paying collateral. So in February 2022, the inflation forecast 6 months ahead was 4.5, from average 5.4 in 21. Inflation was coming down towards our target. We were well set. But then the Ukraine war hit. Starting in January, there were tensions. And then we know that the first impact was on food, wheat prices, as well as crude oil prices, because Russia is a big exporter. And our consumption basket is very dependent on these two. So Indian inflation really shot up, and it exceeded 6% for 10 months after the Ukraine war. Over January, October, inflation was 6.9. Now, this time, the monetary policy in September, we have to write a letter. For 3 quarters, inflation exceeds our target. This is a very important discipline on the and improves the credit on the committee and increases the credibility of inflation targeting. So we wrote the letter in September saying that the war effects, etc. And also it was aggravated by global excess demand. created in advanced economies huge fiscal transfers when there were these supply chain bottlenecks and transportation costs had really gone up. So what happened was this huge amount of money because people were not going to restaurants and so on because of lockdowns and fear of COVID. So they just started importing huge amounts from China, exercisers, gyms were shut and so on. So these container ships were just piling up in ports. They had nothing to take back and there were all kinds of problems in the logistics. And all this raised global inflation also. But now for us, although these are supply shocks, but if supply shocks are going to be persistent and inflation sets in above, is going to continue for a few months, then to anchor inflation expectations, the flexible fit dharma, as I call it, is that that you must raise repo rates 1-to-1 with expected inflation. And there was a recovery in the economy by then, so we were not so concerned about growth. So we needed to make the real policy rates were negative during the pandemic period. Now we needed to make them positive. And since they had been cut steeply, they were at around 4 below that, the reverse repo, 3.5%. So we needed to take large steps to reach it. First, withdraw liquidity. So that's why there was a lot of criticism that you're not, because inflation had risen since February, actual inflation, but we were on pause February in the February policy, then the April policy. So there's a lot of criticism. The Reserve Bank is not acting, they're not following inflation targeting, but we had to withdraw liquidity because otherwise in the market there's excess liquidity, rates would fall, they would be below the repos. Just raising the repo would not work. And as I said, in April 21 started withdrawing liquidity. So we were preparing for it. The standing deposit facility was introduced. And then there was an out of turn because the other thing because to guide expectations, we have a fixed schedule of meetings 6 times in the year pre-announced. So normally we meet in April, then in June. So this time we had an out of turn, absolute secret. Nobody knew. The markets get into a real panic when they hear that there's going to be a meeting and it could be rate action. So it was secret. There was an out of schedule secret meeting in May where we raised interest rates. Now the tradition in raising interest rates to raise small steps, 25. But then if we were 3 and inflation was running at +6, that is a negative real, we had to raise fast, so 50 BPS. And we raised in successive meetings over May to February, raised 250 points to 6.5. Now this was higher than expected inflation. And since the recovery was still fledgling, we had to make up for loss during the pandemic. There were still growth risks from the global geopolitics and slowdown. So the rate was, we didn't want to raise real rates above 1.5%. And since April 23, we have been on a pause. Now the market guidance is not forward-looking. The tightening cycle, you can't do that. It's data dependent, but markets internalize the impact of incoming data on the forecast and therefore on possible policy action. And now in this period, we had, because of some food price problems in January, February, inflation was high. November, December, it came down 22 below our tolerance, below 6%. In March, June, it was 4.9, again, coming down towards 4%. But then in June and July, these floods, vegetable inflation spike. In July, inflation has to 7.44. But this is regarded as transient because tomatoes, there'll be a new crop and so on. So the 1 year ahead forecast is 5.4, and then real inflation is still, repo rate is still positive. And we are sustaining the highest growth rate, continue to sustain good growth rates. So over this period, we have a lot of, like this week, I think I've had to reply to questions from 8 journalists, and there's CNTV there. That meeting is on Monday. So after every minutes are released, the minutes of the external policy of the MPC members is released 14 days after the policy. Then the media has a lot of questions about it. And because we regard communication as important, explaining what we are doing is important to guide markets. the external members really do talk to the RBI has a press conference, but external members, individual journalists approach us, and so and we answer their questions and help to their doubts or their understanding of what is going on. And there's a lot of media feedback and discussion. So in the early years of the MPC, we were always asked, why does everybody agree? There's no disagreement. Because during the pandemic, everybody agreed that you needed to keep rates low and stimulate the economy. But at turning points, there is disagreement. So typically, I found the external members want change earlier than the RBI takes longer. So we start pulling. And there also communication helps because our positions are there and then the external argument builds for change. So, and all this dissent, I have a research paper on this with some colleagues from IIT Patna, where we show that dissent actually improves forecast accuracy and helps improve the credibility of inflation targeting. So actual monetary policy coordination worked well in this period also. This was how we talked about, that shifting that AS down through inflation and anchoring inflation expectations. That was done. The keeping repo rates neutral near the equilibrium levels. But fiscal action also, the government focused on the short-term action on commodity prices, cutting excise twice, really brought down inflation expectations of household, and then infrastructure investment and fiscal consolidation. Soon after the pandemic, working to decrease the fiscal deficit, although there was a lot of pressure on them to just spend like the advanced economies are spending. And they did do some spending, although revenue largely because revenue had collapsed and GDP had collapsed, the debt ratio shot up from 75 to 90%. But then they embarked on fiscal consolidation, and a higher growth is helping bring down the deficit ratios and the debt ratios. And so in this period, we were able to focus on, because monetary policy in Indian conditions affects output more than inflation, apart from anchoring inflation expectations. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'll go a bit fast now. I wanted to spend more time on the stabilizations. That is the main theme of these meetings. So overall, we've maintained good balance. And I would say that in COVID-19, we had a new kind of policy response. Normally, we used to tighten when there were outflows, as we saw in the initial first year of the pandemic, large outflows. Then even last year, there were large outflows and people saying reserves are falling, you need to raise rates, you need to follow the Fed. They don't think that the Indian MPC has independence from the Fed. But if they had overstimulated and had excess demand, we did not. We did not need to raise rates as much as they did. They were raising from 0. We were raising from 4. Our repo rate was at 4 during the pandemic. Yeah. So we did not need, and we showed that with the foreign exchange reserves, intervention, etc., we have independence. And as growth was established, inflows returned, reserves were built up again. So, and the other big factor I want to flag of our experience in this period, how was it different from the stimulus after the global financial crisis? There, stimulus was given but was not taken back. Here, everything was reversed. You saw how repo rates were raised in quick steps to reach equilibrium. There in T011, it was famous that they had 13 rate rises. They were not working, small steps. It took very long. Fiscal deficit was not reversed for 4 years. It had expanded. So all this this timely reversal and continuing reforms prevented risk premiums from rising and created correct incentives. So in contrast with what was happening in advanced economies, where there was overspending, then over-tightening, which and neglect of the supply side, total neglect, the saying people have suffered, incomes have fallen, give them money. And this will create demand and help in growth recovery. The same argument was made to force us in India to overstimulate, but we did not buy it. Because we said that if supply is crashed, there's a lockdown, demand will create inflation, not create output. And the problem is the advanced economies, US especially, has spillovers for the rest of the world. And monetary stimulus really affects inflows and has immediate spillovers. And their over-tightening continues to create spillover. At the same time, very large 525 BPS increases built in financial fragility and shocks. We saw the banks, small banks collapsed there. And they have during this whole decade of quantitative easing, huge debt has been built up. And this becomes under stress when rates rise. Fiscal debt has increased tremendously in the US. It's continuing to increase. So they've recently been downgraded, but they have the advantage of printing the world's reserve currency. They just keep printing the dollar and financing themselves. But now they will face higher interest rates. But in India, it was absolute opposite. We were regarded as a fragile economy with double deficits. Public sector banks were seen as fragile. Their own regulator expected, NPAs to go up during the pandemic. But the last decade and continuing regulatory reforms, broad-based, we also regulate non-bank financial sector, which the West does not. Anyway, I don't have time to go into that. But we have diversity in sources of finance. This table shows you what was the forecast for NPAs, and the actual was much lower. And these days it's celebrated that Indian banks' NPAs are really down and their balance sheets are strong. They're doing very well, and credit growth is rising despite the pandemic and so on. And we're able to sort of use the financial sector. Of course, I don't want to say everything is rosy. There are a lot of risks continuing: climate change, crude oil, geopolitics, these large inflows and outflows. And now with India's presidency in the G20, we are talking about ways to improve safety nets for emerging markets. Let's hope something happens there. This is the way oil prices fluctuate. And there's some financial deregulation in the US, after which this volatility became much higher. And this really affects us negatively. So to conclude, finally, as I said, that kind of structure that I set up and how the experience of stabilization has been in line with that structure, which has helped give us a good experience with continuing supply side reforms, credibility in anchoring inflation expectations, flexibility to look through transient supply shocks. So I would say stabilization policy here followed what I call BCCR, which is balance, counter-cyclical coordination and reforms. So there was a balance between demand and supply side measures. We did not overstimulate demand and supply had collapsed. Balance between growth and inflation, between inflation targeting and financial stability, between monetary and fiscal policy. So, and the reforms were continuing, but at the same time, they were those that were feasible and that improved the supply side, reduced costs. And there was also smoothing shocks. So for non-inflationary growth in India, I think we have to learn lessons from these episodes, avoid large policy shocks, smooth external shocks, continue with supply side improvements, keep real interest rate near the natural rate, the neutral rate, and below the growth rate, coordinate across policies, and be wary of risks, continuing risks, continue to make our economy resilient for our reserves and other sensible fiscal consolidation, etc., helps with external shocks. And we have to make ourselves resilient to climate change and possible weather irregularities. And we also have to guard against inappropriate policies. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. I kept some time for questions.
Sarah, ma'am.
Yes?
Ma'am, as you said about the credit market of public sector banks, what are your views on privatization of this public sector banks? Is this really the need of the hour?
No, I don't think so. As I said, in that slide, I said that diversity is a big strength of the Indian financial sector because private banks all do similar things, and that creates exposures in one direction. So it's like any diversification is a way to guard against shocks. And moreover, public sector banks have a huge, like the Jan Dhan Yojana. And we saw that when they stopped lending because they had NPAs, they stopped lending, credit just tanked because private banks largely lend to retail, not to industry. So, but the point is that you need to have much better governance in public sector banks. You need freedom. The government must not dictate what they should do. And actually, I joined the board of IDBI Bank, which is a public sector bank. This was in, I think, 2010 sometime. And the reason I joined it when I was invited, I get a lot of invitations. I say no, but this because they had the worst NPAs. So I was studying NPAs. I wanted to see what on the ground, what is it? And I saw that they were doing a lot of policies. There was absolute independence. The government was not interfering. And in fact, that is why when I joined the MPC, had to resign from IDBI Bank board. I resigned because there's conflict of interest possibly between bank and being on the MPC. So, but I told them that bringing out their financial stability report that NPAs are going to fall. You're predicting they're going to rise. They've done a lot of things. They've restructured, the reforms, the Indian Bankruptcy Code, and they had made provisions for all these bad loans. And they'd sold assets, restructured, done a lot of things, improved risk-based lending, and so on. And so the money coming in was helping their profits because they'd already made provisions against them. So that is why they were able to bring down NPAs fast. So that just shows, and the reason they got into trouble at all, public sector banks, as NPAs rose over the 2010s, was because after the GFC, these banks were pushed to lend for infrastructure, and they were pushed to lend to private parties. When India did not have any bankruptcy code, and there was evergreening of loans earlier, that if a company is in trouble, the promoter would take out those assets and make money and keep getting money from the bank to keep the firm going, that sort of thing. So that is why this NPA crisis continued so long, because this government did not want to refinance the banks until you had the code in place. And this code really changed behavior. And you saw the deleveraging in the corporate sector. Corporate sectors started repaying loans, cutting their loans because they knew they could lose their assets, for the first time. So it really improved incentives. So better incentives, governance, regulation is very, very much more important than ownership, for banks to do well. And banks can undertake social policies. Like this time in this episode, we found that during the pandemic, they wanted to encourage lending to MSMEs. But the government was giving a direct subsidy. Earlier, the public sector banks would do it and they would take the economic impact. But this time the government, and that's a much better way to subsidize. So even private banks were lending to MSMEs. Kotak Bank did a lot of it. So you can have social programs without getting public sector banks in trouble as long as they're well designed, and you give them independence to make commercial decisions.
Chant here. So firstly, thank you for accepting the invitation and for this elaborate discussion on the macro stabilization policies. So I have a question which I think I had asked even during our alumni meet at IGIDR, and there was quite a lot of heated debate with Dr. Mridul Sagar and many others. So especially during the crisis periods, how important is the role of central bank independence, especially from the domestic fiscal policy? Because you have mentioned about the independence from the international front. We are quite independent from the Fed. But how important is it from the fiscal dominance, the independence from the fiscal dominance?
Yeah, good question. And I think I had this on in a bullet in my slide, but I forgot to talk about it. when I talked about emphasized monetary fiscal coordination, I always emphasize that this does not mean that there is no independence or that the central bank has lost its independence. I think in 2010s, when there was a lot of conflict between the government and the central bank, independence was taken too literally, as if the central bank must not talk to the government, must do what it wants regardless of. And that is not coordination, and that led to, we saw outcomes were very bad in that period. Because, for example, the AQR was started before the bankruptcy code was implemented. The government was not ready to refinance, and banks were told to undertake this asset reconstruction as an whatever that measurement. So because of that, they just realized their bad loans and they stopped lending, and credit growth just tanked. So better coordination would have prevented this thing happening. But coordination does not mean lack of independence, because as soon as you are committed to the neutral real interest policy rate, if inflation is going to be high, the government does not take supply side action. So supply side shocks persist beyond 3 months. They look like they're leading to second round effects. Wages are rising, inflation is getting entrenched. Then the central bank is going to raise rates. The MPC is going to raise rates because you have committed to giving that positive real rate in an upcycle. Yeah. So you are independent in the sense that you will raise rates if the government does not take action. If the government takes action, like they did at critical times in 21, cut oil taxes and so on, which brought oil excise. But then that gives us the freedom to prevent, to keep real rates lower and allow growth to recover, right? So this is coordination is absolutely compatible with independence of the central bank and the credibility of inflation target. So good you asked the question and I could clarify. So I hope you said there was a huge debate. So what were why people were saying that if you coordinate, you're not independent? Is that the issue? What was the issue?
Dr. Parthare. So as soon as I asked this question, Dr. Parthare just started saying that it does not exist, which immediately kind of hurt, you can say, Dr. Mridul Sagar in that regard. And then both of them had debate for almost 15 to 20 minutes in that regard.
Okay. Yeah. No, so it doesn't exist in the sense you can't be rude, you can't ignore, you can't not talk, then there will be problems, But if you're polite and you explain your position, in fact, I used to tell my class, and I think that's still true. There was an old officer in RBI, old means long time back, he was there. So he was telling me there's excellent coordination between the RBI and the government, because the government really wants low inflation. It's important for a democracy and so on. So whenever we want to do something and they don't like it, we tell them, if we don't do this, inflation will rise. They immediately say, yes, 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 do it. So there are ways of intelligently coordinating. Yeah, we need to do that.
Thank you, Professor Ashima Goyal, ma'am. While most of us know you through your work, having a live session with you has been a rewarding experience. Your presence and insights has inspired the budding economists here today. We have a token of appreciation for ma'am. May I request our alumnus, Dr. MP Prashant, who completed his PhD from IGIDR under ma'am's supervision, to collect a token of appreciation on ma'am's behalf. May I request our Controller of Examinations, Sri Sanjay Sahani sir, to hand over our token of appreciation. Thank you. As part of proceedings, now we have 4 presentations by our students. These are short presentations in contemporary policies and issues put up with an idea to engage in a meaningful discussion. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, followed by 5 minutes for questions, comments, suggestions, and additional remarks. The presentation is sequenced as follows. Sri Satwik Naik will be speaking on the transition from the LIBOR benchmark interest rate. Secondly, Sri Asanga Reddy will make a presentation on de-dollarization. Thirdly, Sri T. Sai Gopal will speak on transformation of India's payment industry with a special focus on central bank digital currency. And finally, Sri Sai Swaroop will be sharing his thoughts on ramifications of India's rice export ban on broader economy. I request these students to follow the sequence and stick to the given time limit. I request Brother Satwik Naik to start the session.
Om Shri Sai Ram, offering our collective pranams at Swami's Lotus Feet. Respected Controller of Examinations, Sanjay Sahni sir, faculty members and my dear brothers, loving Sai Ram to all of you. Today I'm going to present on the topic LIBOR transition. So these are the contents of the presentation. LIBOR, calculation of LIBOR, objectives, causes of the transition, alternative reference rates which have come up, RBI's response to LIBOR transition, challenges and benefits, and way forward. So the last 3 topics covers the Indian perspectives. LIBOR, or London Interbank Offered Rate, is the rate at which the banks lend to and borrow from one another in the interbank market. In other words, it is the interest rate charged for the short-term borrowings in the interbank market. It is administered and published by the Intercontinental Exchange Benchmark Administration, and they publish these LIBOR also, and it is regulated by the UK Financial Conduct Authority, and it is published across 5 different currencies, including the United States dollar, the euros, the British pound sterling, Japanese yen, and Swiss franc, and published for 7 different maturities, which include overnight, 1 week, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. And this is used for various financial instruments such as derivatives, bonds, loans, deposits, and other products. Coming to the calculation of LIBOR. So the 18 global banks, including the Barclays Bank, Bank of America, Citibank, Deutsche Bank, the Royal Bank of Canada, and many other banks, they submit the estimates of their interest rates they would have to pay in order to borrow from the interbank market. And the benchmark administration removes the 4 highest and lowest submissions and calculates the average or the arithmetic mean. So here we can observe one of the major drawback which can occur, one of the major drawback is it's possible for the banks to submit lower rates and manipulate LIBOR fairly easily. This is because the banks which submit the interest rates, their estimates of interest rates is based on their, is supposed to be based on their actual transaction data and their expert judgment. But it is possible for these banks they actually provide estimates of what they're willing to pay for the funds borrowed instead of what they actually pay for the borrowings. Having explained what is LIBOR and how it is calculated, these are the objectives of my presentation: to highlight the need for transition from LIBOR to alternative reference rates, to give an overview of the recommended alternative reference rates and India's current position with respect to these reference rates. Causes of the transition: its role played in worsening the global financial crisis. So first is the credit default swaps. So various financial institutions, including the banks, they issued subprime mortgages which were insured using the credit default swaps. And the credit default swaps, the rate of interest for it was set using the LIBOR. And American International Group issued huge volumes of credit default swaps on subprime mortgages. And following the crash of real estate market in 2007, and the even larger market meltdown in 2008 forced AIG into bankruptcy, resulting in one of the biggest government bailouts in history. This created negative sentiment in the interbank market, which resulted in many banks becoming reluctant to lend to each other, and every day the LIBOR rate setting banks estimated higher and higher interest rates, because of which the loans became expensive, and there was a liquidity crunch in the economy, which further caused a financial disaster in the form of a global financial crisis. Thus, LIBOR was one of the major factors which created the global financial crisis. LIBOR manipulation, as I explained in the calculation of LIBOR slide, which explained the method of calculating LIBOR. So the LIBOR setting banks, they exploited the loophole in the method of calculation, and in 2012, the extensive investigations revealed that the multiple banks, including the Barclays, Deutsche Bank, Rabobank, UBS, and the Royal Bank of Scotland, manipulated LIBOR rates for profits. Following the accusation of LIBOR rigging, almost $10 billion in fines were meted out across the financial industry. So this graph explains what I said in the previous slide. As we can observe here, from 2006 to 2008, there was a steep increase in the USD LIBOR for the 3 months maturity. And these high interest rates were estimated by the LIBOR setting banks following the bankruptcy of AIG. And immediately there has been a drastic decrease, and LIBOR went below 1% due to the manipulation of the LIBOR setting banks for profits. In 2017, the UK Financial Conduct Authority stressed the need for moving away from LIBOR, and in 2020, the Intercontinental Benchmark Administration announced that it would stop publishing USD LIBOR for 2 tenors, that is 1 week and 2 months, and for all the tenors for the remaining 4 currencies. After 30th June 2023, it would cease to publish the remaining USD settings. The various global regulators encouraged new contracts should be linked to the alternative benchmarks, not assume the availability of LIBOR post 2021. Thus came various alternative reference rates. The key characteristic of these reference rates are, it is based on the actual transaction data from deep and liquid markets with the intention of making it more sustainable and robust than the current LIBOR rates. So here we can observe for each currency there is a various reference rates and it is administered by their respective central banks. For example, for the United States dollar, there is secured overnight financing rate administered by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. One major difference between the alternative reference rate and LIBOR is that LIBOR is a forward-looking rate, which is an interest rate based on the expectations of the future interest rates, while the alternative reference rate is a backward-looking rate based on the actual transaction data. RBI's response to LIBOR transition. The Reserve Bank of India in July 2021 had laid its roadmap for LIBOR transition. This included the assessment of exposures linked to the LIBOR and steps to be taken to address risks arising from the cessation of LIBOR, including preparation for the adoption of alternative reference rates. It also encouraged the banks and other financial institutions, including the customers, to discourage to refrain from using LIBOR as their reference rate and use either modified Mumbai interbank forward outright rate or any other alternative reference rate instead of Mumbai interbank forward outright rate, which is published by the Financial Benchmark India Private Limited. In May 2023 notification, it mentioned that a smooth transition with respect to LIBOR settings that have ceased to be published post December 31st, 2021 has been achieved. Here, the LIBOR settings that have ceased to be published includes only all the maturities of 4 currencies other than United States dollar and 1 week and 2 month maturities of the United States dollar. Majority of new transactions are now undertaken using the alternative reference rates such as the secured overnight financing rate and the modified Mumbai interbank forward outright rate. So the interest rate ceilings on the foreign currency non-resident banks deposits has been revised by the RBI as follows here, and there is an upward revision by 50 basis points for the deposits, while for external commercial borrowings and trade credits there is around hike by 50 basis points. So growth in modified MIFOR linked swaps. In the first 15 months, the benchmark rate has shown uptrend in the traded volumes of the contracts or the swaps here, which is considered linked with the modified Mumbai interbank forward outright rate. And the modified Mumbai interbank forward outright rate is still on its way to completely replace the Mumbai interbank forward outright rate. So challenges in the transition: identifying and adapting suitable alternative reference rates to replace LIBOR. Different countries and markets have chosen different rates. As basket of currencies become wider, banks and financial institutions need to assess the suitability of these rates for their specific contracts. Here we can observe that I mentioned alternative reference rates to replace LIBOR. And in one of the slides, I've also mentioned RBI notification telling that there is already a smooth transition from LIBOR to other reference rates. This point mainly focuses on other alternative reference rates as well, like the Sterling Overnight Index Average of the United Kingdom and other reference rates. Transitioning from LIBOR requires making significant adjustments to internal systems, processes, and models. Banks and financial institutions need to invest in necessary technology upgrades and ensure smooth integration without disrupting day-to-day operations. Challenges of market liquidity and product availability. This can impact pricing and availability of certain financial products. The benefits: it has the potential to reduce the risk premium associated with LIBOR. The risk premium which was charged for the LIBOR-linked contracts was mainly to reduce the volatility, and the second reason being was the risk of credit default. And the second benefit is it introduces more competition in the market for the reference rates, which reduces the cost of financing for the borrowers. The way forward: a lot has been achieved in capacity building of Indian banks, but other financial institutions like the non-banking financial corporations still face challenges to assess the impact of LIBOR transaction on their existing contracts, products, and financial instruments. And second thing is inform and educate customers about the transition from LIBOR to other alternative reference rates. This includes providing clearly and timely communication about changes and impacts on the existing contracts. Thank you. These are my references. Any questions?
Sairam, offering my humble pranams at the Swami's lotus feet, respected dignitaries, respected faculty members, and all my dear brothers. A loving Sairam to one and all. So, presentation. So today I am talking about de-dollarization. So main objective of my presentation will be brief overview about de-dollarization and also policies for de-dollarization. So what is meant by de-dollarization? De-dollarization is a process by which countries reduce their dependence on US dollar as a dominant currency. But recently we saw in news every country started following moving towards de-dollarization, and every country started making trade agreements to trade in their own local currencies. What are the reasons behind this de-dollarization? So the first reason is the over-dependence on single currency. For example, 59% of world foreign reserve currency is dollar, which means most of countries using dollar as a reserve currency. So what happens because of that? There will be so many fluctuations in the dollar. For example, US country is, from past few years, US country is running on very large budget deficits, which lead to concern about inflation and also fluctuations of dollar. For example, imagine that dollar appreciates. So India is a country where we import a lot of crude oil. So because of that, and crude oil is priced and traded in dollar. So imports will become costlier, and also crude oil prices will increase. And imagine the same situation if dollar depreciates. It makes our exports will become more competitive in other world, in global economy. So this is the one reason why why countries moving towards de-dollarization. So second main reason is dependence on US Fed monetary policy. So whenever US increases its Fed rates, which means in US interest rates are increasing, so it will attract a lot of foreign capital. For example, an individual who invested in a country like India, so because of interest rates in US increased, they will feel like US assets will become more attractive. US dollar and as well as US treasury bills will become more attractive, which lead to outflows in FIIs of India. So because of that, rupee will depreciate. When rupee depreciate, it will make imports costlier. So because of that, our Indian country or any other country will import imported inflation. So because of that, despite of our national interest, still we are following US monetary policy. So because of that, Indian country also will increase interest rates according to US Fed rate, because so that we can curtail our FIIs, so that the need of holding foreign currency in order to hedge inflation will get reduced, so that assets which are denominated in our own currency we can expand. So third reason why countries moving towards de-dollarization is vulnerability to US sanctions. For example, in recent scenario, US put in so many sanctions on Russia. Because of that, Russia was unable to use half of its reserves. So SWIFT system banned Russian banks. Because of that, Russia was unable to make transactions with so many other countries. For example, in previous years, once upon a time, one-fifth payment system banned in Iran. So because of that, Iran lost 30% of foreign revenue. So countries started thinking about that. What will happen if the same thing happens to our country? So they started reducing their dependence on dollar and they started diversifying their risk. That's why countries started moving towards de-dollarization. So these are the main reasons why de-dollarization is happening. And here the question arises, is there any alternative for de-dollarization? So Chinese yuan. Now currently Chinese currency is becoming an anchor currency. According to IMF papers, what happened is recently when they studied 130 countries, they saw that in East Asia there was a drastic increase in usage of China currency, and which was 0% in 2014. Now it became to 20% in 2021. So countries are following China's currency, and recently French government also bought 65,000 tons of LNG, and they paid their first transaction using China currency. But again here the problem arises whether US currency is fully convertible or not. For example, US currency got the dominance position because at the cost of current account deficit. But a country like China can't afford that risk. Country like China can't take that current account deficit. So people going for another alternative called cryptocurrency. For example, recently Iran and Russia came up with discussions where they are going to introduce cryptocurrency, which is backed up by certain gold reserves, and they are going to trade for bilateral trade. But again here problem issues, cryptocurrency is not legalized in so many countries. Country like India, it's not legalized. And also the technology which is useful and which is used to transact in cryptocurrency are not available in so many countries. That's why again BRIC economies. So BRIC economies also coming up with a new currency called BRICS currency, and they want to do trade based on the new currency called BRIC currency. BRICS is a country of BRICS is a combination of 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These 5 countries are having different cultures, and also they have different politics, and also they have different economies. So all those economies coming to at a single point and implementing currency is quite difficult. Even though if BRIC currency come, and there is no sure that we are going to achieve monetary policy very effectively. So these are in short term, there is no other alternative for dollar, but in long term, we can say that cryptocurrency is more feasible than China currency and the BRICS currency. And India pushes trade in local currency. So recently we saw that India made an agreement with UAE where they are going to buy million barrels of oil, and they are going to trade in their own local currency. But one of the main good thing in this is it enhances ability to negotiate with our trade partner for favorable trade. But again there are so many challenges because India is a emerging country where India have only 2% trade share in global trade, whereas a country like USA have 24% trade share in global trade. So India should follow a gradual approach. It can't shift it directly move towards de-dollarization. So India started only with 18 countries. Those are all countries are emerging countries and very small countries. And also India is a country where it is having a $619 billion of debt. Whenever we are directly shifting against dollar, it will lead to fluctuations in exchange rate. Imagine that rupee depreciates. When rupee depreciates, again it will become so much burden to repay the same debt. So that is the reasons. And policy, through tight monetary policy, we can reduce credit growth. We can control credit growth. And through fiscal consolidation, government can increase their revenue, and also government can reduce their government expenditure. Through that, there will be a reduce in government borrowing from central bank. So that both these policies restrain aggregate demand. When we restrain aggregate demand, it will lead to decrease in prices. So again here the same case. In order to hedge inflation, government used to hold foreign currencies. Now it got reduced, and assets denominated in our local currency can expand. And also incentives for exporters and investors. The people who are exporting and the people who are investing in local currency, if you give some tax incentives, it will increase and it will incentivize people can do more trade in our local currency. And also dual currency bonds. So dual currency bonds are the bonds which are denominated in both local currency as well as in dominant currency. So gradually we have to shift our balance towards local currency so that we can attain de-dollarization. And also bilateral and regional agreements. As I mentioned before, countries should start making an agreements with different countries to trade in their own local currencies. And also consumer awareness campaigns. And government should conduct so much campaigns regarding that what are the disadvantages of dollarization, what will happen, what it will lead, so that people will start about thinking uses and disadvantages of dollar, and it also move towards de-dollarization. That's all. Thank you. Sairam. Any questions?
Check. Sairam, brother. Yeah. Firstly, a great topic because this has been discussed for the past 1.5 to 2 years in almost policy circles as well as in corporates quite a lot. So, in line with this topic, there is another topic I think in the recent past which has come up, that is the oil prices and dollar. They have started co-moving in the same direction for the first time since history, since the past 80 odd years, it might be. So, in that scenario, do you have any views where you can suggest that, okay, how important can the de-dollarization be when the oil and dollar are moving in the same direction, primarily because, as you mentioned in your slide, that oil prices are denominated in dollars. So, when both of them increase, that is dollar appreciates as well as the oil prices increase, it's a double whammy effect for a country like India, who is a net importer. And just like India, majority of the countries are net oil importers. So in this scenario, how would you have some views on how can we say de-dollarize, or is de-dollarization possible in this scenario when your major importing commodity is denominated in that currency?
I think that's what I told before also. In country like India can't directly move towards a de-dollarization. You should follow a gradual approach. That may be a reason, but I don't have much idea about that. I'll get back to you.
This is not exactly an answer to what you're looking, but perhaps, US economy, which is nearly 1/4 of world economy, and post Bretton Woods system, especially, when the marking or pegging with the gold was revamped in 1971. All the countries in the world are looking for most stable currency to have it in their reserves. That is the undercurrent. So far, because US has been big, and you only said the pain of current account deficit, so US dollar was accepted, and the general understanding is US is too big to fail. But instead of looking for one alternate currency, or having a bipolar view of being US dollar there and not at all being there, we should focus, I think the focus should be on taking one currency, say for example India, and the moves that where policies are in line with, wherever possible have a bilateral trade in currency any other than US dollar. So I think that should be a gradual approach because the fate of optimal currency areas is seen by the Euro region. So I think it is a step-by-step process where each country expands its trade territory by trading with the currency that is favorable to them. So it is again a very, very capitalist approach. This is I just wanted to weigh in here. I don't know if, I answered what you're looking for.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Actually, yes, it answers the question. And in a way, it is important because we have been having SDRs for quite a long time, right? Which is a basket of currencies. So it's very difficult to find the optimal basket of currencies because now China has been trying to enter into the SDR basket for a long time. And it depends on individual weights. Even if we take SDR, I think USD captures almost 60% or more than 60% of the weight in that category. So even if we make a basket, how important can the role of USD is something which time will tell. But yes, thanks for the presentation. Anyone else?
Om Shri Sai Ram, offering our collective pranams at the lotus feet of our Divine Master, Bhagavan Shri Satsai Baba Varu, respected elders, revered teachers, and all my dear brothers, a loving Sai Ram to one and all. Years back, we had seen that people counting bunch of currency notes and keep it in an envelope carefully, and then they used to travel miles of distance just for the sake of handing over that cover for someone for some purpose. And now, thanks to the digital advancements, we are able to complete the same sort of work at our fingertips. With these lines, let me take you all to the topic on which I am going to present: transformation in India's payment industry, with a special focus on central banks' digital currency. So, we all know that payment is an activity where in turn we offer someone by giving something just for the sake of availing some service or commodity from them. Industry is nothing but sum total of all the activities involved in this particular process. And if we look into the payment system, it is to facilitate the clearing and settlement of monetary and other financial transactions. With these lines, the objectives of my presentation is just to revise the evolution of India's payments industry, and also to discuss briefly about the features, designs, pros and cons, and current status of the most trending central bank's digital currency. And now, if we look into the evolution of India's payment industry, it started cashless with barter system. Now it is moving towards again a cashless economy. It started with barter system where we used to transact commodities to commodities, and then we moved to coinage, and then paper currency, and then we started using card payments, and now we are doing everything with a device which we carry every day. If we want to see how the digital evolution of digital transaction, this is how it looks. It started with ECS in the year 1990. It's nothing but electronic clearing services. And then in the year 2004, they introduced RTGS, which is nothing but real-time gross settlements. And then we moved on real-time gross settlements. Here the minimum limit is 2 lakhs. And then we moved a step forward for NEFT, which is nothing but National Electronic Fund Transfer, where there is no such minimum limit. And then we moved on to IMPS, Immediate Payment Services, and then CTS, Check Truncation Services, and then NACH, National Automated Clearing Houses, and now the most booming Unified Payment Interfaces, that is UPI, which more or less all of us are using. And this is how the trends, the upward trends of those particular services looks like. And if we consider the volume of transactions, it is more with respect to UPI, because more or less majority of the population are using it. And when it comes to the volume of transactions, it is more with RTGS. Even though less strength of population use it, the value which we transact will be more when it comes to RTGS. And now, if we see the forces which are reshaping the payment industry, it's an amazing pictorial representation given by E&Y. So if we see here, these are the 7 forces which are reshaping the payments industry. If we start with real-time payment rails, which enables the payment service providers to provide their services to the common man for the person-to-person or person-to-merchant transactions. One step ahead is the open banking. And also, we are very much familiar with the installment payments, where if you buy a mobile, laptop, or anything of that kind, we'll prefer with this installment payments, which is very much useful for common man, basically in a country like India. And also when we see the digital wallets or super apps, here it is one-stop shop. That means using a single app, we are able to do multiple things. Using Google Pay, we can pay our electricity bills, phone bills, we can send money to our near or dear ones, etc. Also, embedded payments. If we see the services provided by Amazon or Flipkart, anything, when we want to buy some product, we can choose the product there itself, and simultaneously we can pay then and there. And when we move on to the digital currencies and CBDCs, which is an amazing advancement, which I'm going to discuss soon. And when it comes to the development in cross-border payments, because nowadays we are facing this problem because it is costing a lot for cross-border payments. And now let me focus on this particular thing, that is CBDC, Central Bank's Digital Currency. Just by looking into that name, Central Bank Digital Currency, we are able to define what it is. It's a currency which is digital in nature, issued by Central Bank. These are the features of Central Bank Digital Currency. It is issued by Central Bank. It appears as a liability on the Central Bank's balance sheet, and it must be accepted as a medium of payment, legal tender, and a safe store of value by all citizens, enterprises, and government agencies. And this is how the features of CBDC follows. Now we define what CBDC is. But before moving forward, whenever some new product is coming into the market, we should make sure that it should not disturb the existing activity in the economy. So by keeping it in mind, Bank for International Settlements had outlined these three foundational important foundational principles, that is do no harm principle, where the CBDC should not interfere with public policy objectives or prevent banks from performing their monetary stability activities. And the coexistence principle, it should be used alongside and complement existing forms of money. It should not like when we implement CBDC, we should throw away the existing traditional forms of payments. And the innovation and efficiency principle, whenever we are bringing in a new product to the market, it should not destroy the other products or services which are already available. In turn, it should bring competition, and in turn, it should lead to improvement in the efficiency. So now by keeping these things in mind, these are the design choices a country can choose to design its particular CBDC. It includes type of CBDC to be issued. It can be wholesale or retail. Wholesale CBDC is something only a particular set of financial institutions will be able to use it. It's basically used for interbank transactions. Retail CBDC is the other way around. When it comes to models for issuance and management of CBDCs, it can be direct, indirect, or hybrid. Direct means central bank directly issues the CBDC into the market. Indirect means it issues through the intermediaries. Hybrid means it issues through intermediaries, but the public will be able to question central bank. Form of CBDC here is token based or account based. Token based is like how we are using money with us now in our wallet. Account based is basically it will happen through account. All the transactions will be recorded in that particular account. And instrument design, that is remunerated means interest bearing, non-remunerated means non-interest bearing. It can be remunerated or non-remunerated. It's up to the central bank. Degree of anonymity, up to what extent we can maintain the anonymity with respect to the transactions. And after looking into the designs of CBDCs, this is the world scenario as of now with respect to the implementation or introduction of the CBDCs into their economies. There are 11 countries which already launched, and 21 countries are doing with the pilot project. If we see the India scenario, the status is we are doing with pilot project. India launched a CBDC wholesale November 1st, 2022, and in the 4 major cities, that is Mumbai, New Delhi, Bangalore, and Bhubaneswar. It also launched CBDC retail in December 1st, 2022 in the same 4 cities. So we are more or less experimenting, and as of now, the results are coming fruitful. This is the scenario with respect to world. and why the world is running behind this CBDC. What are the benefits out of it? Reduction in cost associated with physical cash management. We all know that it involves lot of cost for printing, for transporting, for maintaining security for the physical currency. When we introduce CBDC, it helps in reducing that particular cost. If I'm not wrong, every year we are spending more than 4,000 crores for this particular activity, and to achieve a less cash economy. Here, CBDC will helps in anti-money laundering as well as combating terrorist financing. And it supports, as we discussed earlier, it supports competition, efficiency and innovations in payments. And to explore the use of CBDC for improvement in cross-border transactions, as we discussed earlier, it is taking, it involves a lot of cost and time when it comes to cross-border transactions. CBDC here will help in removing some of the intermediaries which are facilitating the cross-border transactions, and it supports financial inclusion. One of the major benefits of CBDC is it can be used offline. It can be used for offline payments. In a country like India, where many of the people are not using smartphones, even though they are using smartphones, they're not getting access to the internet. In such cases, CBDC can be helpful because it has the availability of offline payments. And it safeguards the trust of economy in the national currency. Basically, few years back, we had seen the fluctuations with respect to the cryptocurrencies and other private digital currencies, which are not legal. This CBDC in turn brings confidence, in turn brings trust of the common man with respect to the digital currency, because it's backed by central bank. These are the benefits with respect to CBDC. And if we look into the risks that may have a bearing on important public policy issues, as we discussed, it can be remunerated or non-remunerated. If it is remunerated, it leads to bring in competition between commercial banks and this particular CBDC, because there is a chance that people do shift their resources from deposits from commercial banks to these CBDCs, which in turn destroys the commercial banking system. If it is non-remunerated also, whenever people feel that there may be instability in the economy, they'll transfer all their deposits to the CBDCs because it is fully backed by central bank. They have much faith in it. In turn, it leads to bank run. So it is up to the designers what level of interest rate they want to go for. And when it comes to monetary policy also, if it is remunerated, then it helps for monetary policy transmission mechanism. If it is non-remunerated, it's nothing to do with that. And when it comes to risk of increased financial exclusion, as we discussed earlier, there still exist some part of illiteracy in our country. It is difficult for them to avail this kind of service. Privacy risk, as well as we discussed, the anonymity, degree of anonymity. There may be little, there can be risk, privacy risk. Cyber security risk, it's completely done using the technology. There is a chance of cyber security risk as well. Digital and financial illiteracy, it can be one of the risk, which is, it can be one of the obstacle for running of CBDCs. And the conclusion here is, introduction of CBDC has the potential to provide significant benefits, such as these are all the benefits that we discussed earlier, and it would possibly lead to more robust, efficient, trusted and legal tender-based payments option. It is likely to be in arsenal of every central bank going forward. There are associated risks, no doubt, but they need to be carefully evaluated against the potential benefits. Setting this up will require careful calibration and nuanced approach in implementation. Drawing board considerations and stakeholder consultations are important. Technological challenges have their importance as well. Thank you, Sairam. This one, sir? Yes, sir.
Much ahead of other payments sort of.
Yes, sir.
Probably one thing, the suggestion is that, and I think if you give a right axis, you can know how other payment systems are doing. Because see, the base is low, that's why, they are getting cluttered there. If you put it on the right side, they will show their trend actually properly. But one thing, like if the UP is doing that well here in India, how is it that the CBDC can be a success against vis-a-vis UPI?
Sir, actually, UPI is an interface which facilitates the payment, sir. CBDC is a form of currency itself. It's not any medium of payment.
Yeah, that is there, but do you think that people will shift towards, because this is a way of, anyway, it's a electronic cash, right?
Yes, sir.
So, how is it that this is going to make the payment convenient? Will it make the payment system convenient more?
Yes, sir. Sir, as I mentioned earlier, for cross-border payments, it's helpful, and it has a facility of providing offline transactions as well, sir.
Okay, so internet is not that you told.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Om Shri Sai Ram, offering my most humble salutations at Swami's divine lotus feet, respected dignitaries, faculty members, and all my dear brothers, a loving Sai Ram to one and all present over here. Ramifications of India's rice export ban on the broader economy. This is going to be the topic of my presentation. In the course of my presentation, I would be covering various facets, issues concerning and revolving around this topic. As to why is it in news, a brief background, reasons for the ban, and certain geopolitical issues involved. The objective of this presentation is to understand and analyze the reasons behind India's export ban of non-basmati rice and its ramifications. Why is it in news? This issue has captured almost the headlines of all the national and international newspapers for the past 1 month or so. The story begins on 28th July 2023, when the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution have decided to put a blanket ban on the export of non-basmati rice. This has naturally sent shockwaves globally, and the picture you see right over there is from United States, where people, Indian diaspora, especially the Telugu community, rice is a staple food for Indians, and globally also, if you see, more than 3 billion people consume rice. So people started into a panic mode and they started panic buying. Seeing the situation going out of control, many of the grocery stores and market outlets in the United States have tried to limit the sales of rice, and they have opted for a policy wherein each family will be given only one rice bag. In order to understand the gravity of the situation and appreciate the role of India in the global rice trade, we need to look into these facts and figures. India is the second largest producer and the largest exporter of rice. It accounts for 40% of the global rice trade. This ban could impact 80% of India's rice exports. And also India exports rice to more than 140 countries. And the graph you see over there, it is pertaining to the year 2022 and 2023. In this year, India has exported close to 21,500 metric tons. If you see the next 4 countries that follows, Thailand, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Burma, that is Myanmar, even the aggregate of their exports will not equal to that of India's. So this gives us a picture as to how important India is for the rest of the world as far as the rice trade is concerned. Now, going directly into the reasons behind India's non-basmati export ban. The most important reason and the obvious reason is if you see the trend in the retail prices of rice, for the past 1 year it has increased by 11.5% and 3% over the past month. That is, they are referring to the month of June. So, in order to allay the rise in the prices, government has decided to put a ban on the export of rice. Basically, government is trying to prioritize its own domestic needs than its international trade. The second reason is there are concern about potential domestic shortage of rice grains. We know that Indian agriculture is predominantly dependent on monsoon. So this year there has been a delay in the onset of monsoon. So there are concerns that the following year's production is expected to go down. So let's try to understand this. There is an ongoing increase in the price of rice, and there is an expectation about anticipation that there will be a fall in the output. So it will further aggravate the inflation in rice. And this reason is quite interesting. There has been a heavy Chinese import of Indian rice. Ironically, China is the largest producer of rice in the entire world. If you see in the first graph, it concerns with China's import of broken rice from the rest of the world. From 2020 onwards, you can see a significant upward trend. And in the second graph, you can see this is with respect to India's export of rice to China. Here also you can see that there has been a significant increase in the exports of rice to China. So there could be like few reasons. Some of the experts in geopolitics and international relations, it's their view. They say that probably if you look at the global prices of rice, Indian rice is relatively cheaper when compared to other countries. So probably some experts say that China is purchasing the rice from India at a cheaper rate and selling it at a higher rate, thereby making a profit. And there is a second reason which says that some of the experts say that one should be suspicious when a country like China is stockpiling so much of rice. They're basically anticipating something that has happened during the Cold War. There's an article which says that whenever a country is planning something uncertain, it will start to import huge amounts of rice and energy requirements. These are basically views and personal opinions of some experts. Though this is not explicitly mentioned by the government, this could be also one of the reasons. To seek permanent protection of public stockholding schemes from WTO. We all know that India runs the world's largest food security scheme, wherein the central government directly procures grain from the farmers and channelizes these food grains through public distribution system to all the intended beneficiaries. This has placed India at the loggerheads with WTO organization, especially with some countries like USA, Japan, Australia, Canada, who claim that Indian agriculture products, especially rice, is heavily subsidized. So we all may think that every country is sovereign, so every country will have their own discretion and rights as far as their subsidies policies are concerned. But under WTO, we have an agreement, we have an agreement on agriculture, and India is a signatory to this. So one of the main pillars of this agreement is domestic support. Domestic support in layman terms can be translated to subsidies that are given by the government. Under this domestic support, all the subsidies that are given by a country are placed under three boxes, that is the green box, amber box, and blue box. When a subsidy of a country is placed under green box, it is given a free hand. In the sense, the country is given discretion as far as their subsidies are concerned. When something is placed in amber box, that is, there is a 10% cap that is put by the WTO, which means if total value of rice produced in India is 100 rupees, India will not be allowed to breach the limit of 10 rupees. So this is a huge concern for developing countries, because they have a huge population to feed, and their farmers are comparatively at a relatively disadvantaged position when we compare with the farmers of developed countries. So India became the first country to invoke this peace clause in the 2013 ministerial meeting held at Bali, Indonesia. By the virtue of invoking this clause, India will be allowed to breach this limit of 10% without having to face any repercussions from the international countries. But this peace clause is a temporary solution. India is trying to seek a permanent solution for its problem. So we have already seen that India accounts for globally 40% of total rice. So India is trying to leverage its position as a major rice producer and it's trying to bring pressure on World Trade Organization to accept its own demands. Now, if we try to understand geopolitics at play, though this is not directly related to the topic, this is just an observation. I would be basically telling 4 events, significant events that have happened over a span of 20 days in the month of July. Though these events seem to be completely unrelated, but if you try to connect the dots and try to knit a story, then you will get a broader picture. So, in the month of July, first Russia revoked from the Black Sea grain deal. By the virtue of this Black Sea grain deal, it's a grain deal that is signed between Russia, Ukraine, Turkey and United Nations, wherein Russia had agreed that it won't be a hindrance in the Black Sea while exporting grains to the international community. Mostly underdeveloping countries and developing countries are getting benefited, they were getting benefited because of this deal. Now Russia revoked unilaterally from this deal. In the same month of July, China banned the export of crucial metals needed for manufacturing semiconductors. To be more precise, they banned 2 metals, that is germanium and gallium. Though they haven't put a complete ban, they have put a cap. In the same month, Saudi Arabia slashed this oil supply, that is voluntarily. And my topic of my presentation, India banned the export of non-basmati rice in the same month. Like, if we connect all the dots and try to form a comprehensive picture, like, is the world going to face a food shortage or energy crisis or a semiconductor shortage this year? I would like to leave you all with these thoughts to ponder upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarup. It was a very nice presentation. My question is, if government has banned rice, don't you think the private players will hoard the rice and will increase the price of the rice? It's possible, right?
Yeah, that could be one of the reasons, but I have also mentioned in the reason number 4 that WTO's protection, Indian government is trying to seek WTO protection. So they basically want this MSP to go into that green box. So when that goes into green box, Indian government will be given a free hand. That is, they can set MSP as much as they want. At that time, because government is allowed to give even a higher MSP, there will be a bumper production in India. So there will be relatively lesser prices at that time. When MSP is higher, farmers will be incentivized to produce more. So there will be more supply and domestic prices will be less. So.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you all the speakers and participants for your initiation and valued inputs. Today's session would not have been possible without tireless support and cooperation from 2 of our alumni brothers. We thank them for their valuable contribution and request them to grace our token of appreciation as I call out their names. I request Dr. Deba Prasad Rath sir to hand over our token of appreciation. Our first brother is Sri Anup K. Suresh. Brother is currently associated with RBI in capacity of an assistant advisor. Similarly, our second brother, Dr. MP Prasad, who is currently associated with ESG Research Analyst, State Street Corp, Bangalore. I also request students who made presentation to come over and receive token of appreciation from sir as I call out their names. Sri Satvik Naik, Sri Asanga Reddy, Sri T. Sai Gopal, and Sri Sai Swarup. Thank you, sir, for giving away token of appreciation. We have come towards the end of today's workshop. May I request Sri B. Sai Prabhakar sir, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, to deliver a vote of thanks. After the vote of thanks, we will close the session with Mangal Arati. Thank you. Sai Ram.
त्वमेव माता च पिता त्वमेव त्वमेव बन्धुश्च सखा त्वमेव त्वमेव विद्या द्रविणं त्वमेव त्वमेव सर्वं मम देव देव त्वमेव सर्वं मम साई देव. Om Shri Sai Ram, offering our collective pranams at Bhagwan's lotus feet. As we come close to this particular workshop, very insightful and very informative, I deem it as my privilege to profusely thank all the distinguished members of this august gathering who joined us in person and also virtually. First and foremost, on behalf of Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Prasanthi Nilayam campus, our foremost gratitude goes to Bhagwan Sri Satya Sai Baba, who is the founder chancellor of Sri Satya Sai Institute of Higher Learning, who continues to be our infinite inspiration for all the pursuits of SSSIHL. We also profusely thank Sri Chakravarti Garu, the Chancellor of the University. Coming to the key university officers, we thank Professor B. Raghavendra Prasad, Vice-Chancellor. We thank Professor B. IGIDR, the Registrar. The Controller of Examination, Sri Sanjay Sahani. Our heartfelt gratitude goes out to our esteemed speakers today who have come all the way and presented some fantastic topics which actually enriched our knowledge on the Indian economy. We thank Dr. Deba Prasad Rath, Principal Advisor, Department of Economic and Policy Research, RBI. Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy, Vice-Chancellor of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar School of Economic University, Bengaluru. Dr. Nadhanael G.V., Director of Division of Reports and Information Dissemination at DEPR, RBI. We profusely thank Professor Ashima Goyal ma'am, member of Monetary Policy Committee, Reserve Bank of India, and also Emeritus Professor of IGIDR, Mumbai. Coming to the department, we profusely thank Professor Vishwanath Pandit sir, who is the founding father and who continues to be the guiding light of our department. We thank Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Geeta Bala ma'am. We thank Head of the Department, Dr. G. Raghavendra Raju sir, who has been instrumental and who played a very pivotal role in organizing this workshop in a very successful manner. And also we thank all the senior professors and the faculty members who actually took care of all the logistics and implementation of various other things regarding this particular workshop. Thank you so much. And also, we have our alumni brothers who are Dr. Prashant, who joined us, who is currently working in State Street Corporation as a ESG research analyst. And also we thank Shri Anup K. Suresh, the Assistant Advisor at RBI. And also we thank all the student brothers who presented their topics, which are very relevant, ongoing, and the emerging trends. Thank you so much. And last but not the least, we thank all our students of the Department of Economics, Humanities, and Social Sciences for their patient listening, for their engagement, and also for their participation. Thank you so much. And we also need to thank the people who are on the AV side, audiovisual. We would like to offer our heartfelt gratitude to Mr. R.V. Raghuram, who is actually in charge of this multimedia room, who takes care of all the mics and visuals. We thank Brother Sanjay Sunil, who has been here, and also the camera. We have Arun brother and many others. And also we would like to thank the university support staff who actually helped us, with the banners and with the pots around and those aesthetics. And thank you so much. And as we bring this event to a close, let us carry the lessons learned and the insights earned in our future endeavors. Once again, a heartfelt thanks to everyone involved. We look forward to meeting again in future and create more such meaningful experiences together. Thank you, Sai Ram. So we will end this session with Mangalarti to Bhagwan, and we can disperse. Sai Ram. जय जगदीश हरे स्वामी सत्य साई हरे भक्त जना संरक्षक भक्त जना संरक्षक परति महेश्वरा ओम जय जगदीश हरे शशिवदना श्रीकरा सर्वा प्राणपते स्वामी सर्वा प्राणपते आश्रित कल्पलतिका आश्रित कल्पलतिका आपद बांधवा ओम जय जगदीश हरे मात पिता गुरुदैवमु मरियंतयु नीवे स्वामी मरियंतयु नीवे नाद ब्रह्म जगन्नाथा नाद ब्रह्म जगन्नाथा नागेन्द्राशयना ओम जय जगदीश हरे ओंकार रूप ओजस्वी ओ साई महादेवा सत्य साई महादेवा मंगल आरती अंदुको मंगल आरती अंदुको मंदर गिरिधारी ओम जय जगदीश हरे नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण 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 ओम नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण नारायण ओम जय सद्गुरुदेवा नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण 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 ओम नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण नारायण ओम जय सद्गुरुदेवा नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण 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 ओम नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण नारायण ओम सत्य नारायण नारायण ओम जय सद्गुरुदेवा ओम शांति 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 समस्तलोकाः सुखिनो भवन्तु समस्तलोकाः सुखिनो भवन्तु समस्तलोकाः सुखिनो भवन्तु ॐ शांति 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 जय बोलो भगवान श्री सत्य साई बाबा जी की जय। Yeah, there is tea and snacks which has been arranged outside, so please take that and leave the